Know me. My name is Daniela Suarez. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at the School of Law in Queen's University, Belfast. And first of all, thank you very much for attending, both the people who are here in person and also the people who are online. I'm the person behind organizing this event. And I really hope that you can learn a lot from the experience of the different experts from both Colombia and Northern Ireland that have been addressing gender-based violence and that will share their insights today in this event. To give you a very general context about why we are here, why I am organizing this event. So this is part of one of the final activities of my postdoctoral fellowship, which focuses in analyzing the narratives or the legal narratives surrounding victimhood and gender-based violence in Colombia and how these narratives have in some way impacted the recognition of fighters that experience gender-based violence in Colombia, especially inside armed groups, guerrilla and paramilitary armed groups. So my research is mostly qualitative research. It's both grounded in my PhD research, but I managed to do a lot of documentary legal research, a lot of, I don't know if you can see this, but just try to move this here. A lot of documentary legal research, semi-structured interviews in Colombia. I also managed to organize a roundtable with some of the key stakeholders that they're basically experts working on this issue of gender-based violence in Colombia. And from all of these activities, I managed to find some interesting results or research results about how Colombia has been addressing the issue of narratives of victimhood and gender-based violence in relation to former combatants that experience this type of violence. Well, now to give you a very general a theoretical framework. So my research is grounded on the theories or the debates on the politics of victimhood. This is basically the debates that tell that victimhood is not an objective label, and it's often used as a political tool both in conflict and post-conflict context. It can have a good impact in some way because it can show how victims can be also political actors and can use their victimhood status or their victim status as a way to claim fundamental rights, as is the case of truth, justice, and reparations in context conflicts or transitional justice settings. But it also, most of the theory has always focused on criticizing some problematic issues of the politics of victimhood. One of them is, of course, the competing victimhood narratives that often occurs when different groups of victims clash to gain to be prioritized or to be more highlighted or to gain a spotlight within transitional justice settings. There is also an issue of hierarchy of victims, especially with some institutional measures, which often tend to prioritize those individuals or those collective of victims that often fit more easily into these ideal victimhood narratives or ideal stereotypes of victims. And the problem of this hierarchization and these competing victimhood narratives is that they leave no space or little space to those individuals that have a complex experience of victimization, as is the case of individuals that are both victim and perpetrator. In Colombia, the politics of victimhood, I probably won't have a lot of time to go into too much depth in this because I want the experts of the topic to discuss many of these issues. But in the case of Colombia, the politics of victimhood have often, the narrative of the ideal victim, you can see that is often associated with the concept of the good Colombian or that individual or citizen that behaves under the rule of law or that behaves accordingly to the status quo. In legal frameworks, I focused a lot on the victims law of 2011 in Colombia that defines who is a victim of the conflict, especially for accessing to reparation mechanisms and humanitarian aid, administrative reparation mechanisms. And when you approach to this law, you will see that the initial definition of victim is quite I would say apolitical, especially because it's influenced a lot by the international legal framework of victimhood. However, when you start going a bit into the depth or what was behind the drafting process of the victims law, you will realize that the legislators also had some, or the definition was also influenced by some prejudices and also some political interests of the legislators. And it's very clear when you read, for example, Article 3, that is the one that defines who is a victim of the conflict that it excludes completely combatants or fighters to be recognized as victims of the conflict and to access to the reparations mechanisms that are provided within this law. This has also been backed up by the Constitutional Court when they did the constitutional review of the law, in the way of, like the Constitutional Court basically said that it's not that the law, it's trying to negate that these individuals or that combatants can suffer harms in the conflict, but in relation to guarantee kind of like the efficiency of the law, they have to prioritize some victims that are more worthy in some sense to the reparations, and those that the Constitutional Court considers that are more worthy is those individuals that behave under the rule of law or that have acted under the rule of law, and therefore combatants are often excluded from like the definition of victim. Then, of course, in Colombia, there is also a gender element of victimhood, especially when we're talking about the ideal victim of sexual and gender-based violence. You will see that this has been like greatly discussed like in different like feminist and gender studies that have associated the ideal victim of gender and based violence with this like civilian woman, cisgender, heterosexual, an innocent woman that often lacks of agency, that is often infantilized, racialized, and that we try to expect that has a respectable profession or a respectable behavior, right? And these kind of like stereotypical narratives and in relation to who can be considered as a legitimate victim of the conflict has impacted the recognition of fighters, especially those fighters that had experienced sexual and gender-based violence in Colombia. In my research, I found out that there is actually kind of like two periods of narratives in some way. Those ones that could be said that were previous to the peace agreement of Colombia of 2016, and that were those narratives that happened after the peace agreement of 2016. In the one of the previous of the peace agreement, you will see more evidently this kind of like stereotypical narrative. So in one hand, you will have those narratives that frame some female fighters as a threat, both as a threat to the security, like interest of the country, but also as a threat to traditional women roles or like the traditional women expectations in conflict. And the other framing is the one of the innocent girls, especially when the women that experienced this type of violence were child soldiers or girl soldiers. But in this case, they go to the other extreme of like emphasize a lot on the childhood or the innocence of these women as a way to kind of like detach them kind of like of their agency and grant them more easily that innocence to make them fit into the ideal victimhood kind of like narrative. So there is, of course, a lack of nuances at the moment of like trying to address this issue in like these institutional decisions or like judicial decisions previous to the peace agreement of 2016. But with the peace agreement of 2016, we have kind of like a change. I would say one of the big elements or one of the big contributions of this is the active engagement of different social movements throughout the peace agreement that I think it has helped to bring a lot of nuance in relation to gender-based violence, in relation to the narratives of gender-based violence, but also a bit more nuance in relation to the experiences of combatants inside armed groups. Of course, there are like the contribution of feminist, LGBTQ movements, indigenous and Afro-descendant and former women fighters has been essential. Each of them, I have to clarify, they have like different agendas and different focus in relation to gender-based violence or gender approach, but from their own agendas, I think they have contributed a lot to bring more nuances into this matter. And this has also impacted basically the narratives that we have been seeing in more recent mechanisms of transitional justice, as has been the case of the Truth Commission and the HEP that we have today, like the judges that are leading these two cases in the HEP. So I will leave it to them to explain a bit more of like what has happened in these two cases. But I think it's very important to pinpoint the relevance of like the change of narratives in their decisions, in which they have bring more nuance, more intersectional approach to the experiences of women and other combatants that have experienced gender-based violence. And I think one of the other points that is relevant or that I found out in my research is, although we have this kind of like progression in relation to a more nuanced narrative, we still have a lot of contested narratives in Colombian context. On one side, we'll have like some narratives of some collectives of victims that still are quite attached, or they instrumentalize a lot the ideal victim narrative as a way to both gain a spotlight within the peace building and the social media and the mainstream media in Colombia, but also as a way to leverage or like to gain some political support from right-wing political spectrum in Colombia. And on the other hand, we have like narratives that come from like former FARC leaders and also by some of FARC, some groups of FARC women, that they try to still protect the reputation of the armed group. So they deny or they downplay the occurrence of gender-based violence. And from my experience, especially throughout like the interviews that I did in Colombia on the roundtable, these narratives, especially the contested narratives or the clashing of narratives, have like some consequences of or impact in the participation of the victims in the cases, especially in the HEP. The participants in both interviews and roundtable, they mentioned, for example, that these type of contested narratives have often end up re-victimizing the victims because like the narratives or like their experiences are being politicized or instrumentalized for political benefit, either for the right-wing party or for like the former FARC leaders. There is also an impact in relation to their lack of self-acknowledgements of as victims, especially many of them don't recognize as victims either because they still are also kind of like assimilated a lot these stereotypes of the ideal victimhood, but also because some of them don't see certain forms of gender-based violence as gender-based violence or as a form of or as an act that should be criminalized, right? Especially those forms of gender-based violence that are not sexual. Then we also have an issue in relation to their collective organization, especially because what the participants said is that, for example, some of the more traditional like women's organizations still have a strong focus on supporting or providing support to civilian women, and they leave kind of like little space to also support women that are combatants or that were combatants. And on the other hand, or in relation to groups of former women combatants, they also often try to separate themselves from those women that have come forward in relation to reporting gender-based violence inside the armed group. And finally, one of the other consequences that it was mentioned is the problem of self-censorship, and basically is the issue that many of these women or victims still face a lot of risk at the moment of coming forward. They also still feel there is a lack of tangible benefits for participating in this transitional justice process. And I think one that I thought it was quite interesting is that some of them have mentioned the fear of losing the support networks with former FARC members, especially because many of them still have kind of like a family or community-like relationship with some former members of the FARC or some former members of the armed group, and they feel that if they come forward, they will lose that support network. So those are kind of like some obstacles or challenges that they face or that prevent them to continue participating in processes like the one that is being carried out by the HEP. And now, like just to finalize some like good practices that I will mention just very briefly, and also just to pinpoint that I will have like a policy brief that I hope is going to be published either, I don't know, this week or next week, that kind of like summarize some of like these results of my research. But some of the good practices that I was able to identify, like from my talks with the experts in relation to this topic, is of course first the participatory framework of the HEP and the other mechanisms of transitional justice in Colombia. They have a direct and meaningful participation of both victims and social movements, and this has contributed a lot in bringing more nuance in relation to gender-based violence and more nuance in relation to victimhood. There is, of course, the intersectional perspective. There is kind of like a guidance principle in the action and the interpretation that judges in the HEP has to do or have to take at the moment of addressing gender-based violence inside armed groups. One important issue is the issue of the anonymization of victims. I would say it's a good practice, especially to try to prevent this self-censorship or try to address a bit this issue of the self-censorship of the victims. And of course, the non-adversarial spaces. Some experts mentioned that the HEP has used focus groups, collective listening sessions with victims that have enabled some of the victims to self-recognize as victims or like to start identifying that experience that they have where gender-based violence in some way. So yes, basically that will be my research or the research that I have done so far. But I think I will just leave now Monica that is going to chair the first panel and the experts that are going to talk in the first panel. So thank you very much again to everyone who is online and who is here in person. And I hope you enjoy it.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first panel. I should say up front, we were going to have a fun time watching a Scottish person try present the Spanish names, and we'll just go and take it as non-offensive. Panel 1 is gender-based violence within armed groups and the challenges of justice, and we will allow the speakers to speak for 10 minutes. They'll go one after the other, and at the end there'll be time for some questions and answers from everyone involved in the panel. First up, we're going to have Judge Lily Rueda, who's a special jurisdiction for peace, alongside a long list of academic accolades. She is a magistrate of the Chamber for Acknowledgement of Truth, Responsibility and Determination of Facts and Conduct of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. And she's here speaking today specifically about macro case 07, which looks at the forced recruitment of children, especially within the FARC, and subcase 3 of macro case 11, which looks at gender-based violence within armed groups. So I'd just like to welcome her to start. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So good morning, and well, good morning in Colombia, actually. We are in Bogota. And thank you very much for this invitation to share and to discuss our work at the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and particularly at the Chamber for Acknowledgement of Truth, Responsibility, and Determination of Facts and Conducts, in which my colleague Judge Oscar Parra and myself are working now. My colleague Oscar is here as well. He's going to talk after me. So in this chamber, we investigate the most serious and representative crimes which amount to international crimes, as you know. And thank you very much for the introduction that was presented before, because it gave us background. So we all know what we are doing in The Hague right now. So in doing these investigations, we follow a macro case approach, and our investigative agenda is comprised now of 11 macro cases, and we are covering different forms of violence that was committed by the former FARC guerrilla, by state armed forces, and by third parties civilians. And actually, as it was mentioned, one of these cases is the case number 7 that I'm leading actually within the chamber. And this case is on the recruitment and use of children in the armed conflict. We opened this case in 2019. And for that, we considered the serious and representative nature of this conduct. And we noted that it had a severe and multiple impact on the rights of the children. It is important when approaching this case that within the chamber, we established that the investigation was going to cover not only the recruitment and the use of children, but also other forms of grave violence that was associated with their lives within the ranks. So far within the chamber, we have established a preliminary data set of facts, and we have revealed the overall scope of the child recruitment phenomenon, which amounted to actually 18,677 children recruited between 1971 and 2016. And we also found that these recruitments occurred throughout the entire country and involved all the FARC territorial structure. Now we have within the case more than 10,000 victims actively participating, and we are including 5 ethnic communities. In terms of findings, 1 year ago, we presented the first indictment in the case, and we determined the occurrence of 5 macro criminal patterns. And I'm going to briefly mention them. The first was the recruitment of use of children, including those under 15 years of age. The second pattern that we found was the cruelly inhuman or degraded treatment, including torture and homicide against children recruited in the context of their lives within the ranks. The third pattern was the reproductive violence affecting recruited girls. The fourth pattern was the sexual violence against recruited children. And the fifth pattern was the discriminatory violence against recruited children with diverse sexual orientation, gender identities, or gender expressions. Well, this sounds kind of simple, just to say that we have these macro criminal patterns, but to reach these conclusions was, in order to reach these conclusions, it was necessary for us not only to perform a comprehensive factual examination, but also we performed an in-depth analysis of the former guerrilla group, including the organizational dynamics, their policies, the lines of command, decision-making, and the processes for execution and control of the orders within the group. We did this by using a complex investigative methodology. This investigative methodology was really challenging for us in different aspects. So I'm going to refer to 3 basic relevant aspects of this methodology and some of the challenges that we faced regarding the investigation of gender-based violence that we documented. So first, in terms of the features of the methodology, we included first the understanding of the child recruitment as a complex criminal phenomenon. And we did not limit the investigation to the moment of incorporation of the children into the ranks, but we included the contextual circumstances leading to its occurrence, the children's experiences during their times in the ranks, and the impacts of the violence in their lives. That was the first feature. Second feature, it's important to notice that we prioritize in the investigation of other forms of violence suffered within the ranks. Of course, we included sexual and gender-based violence, but not only. We also included homicides, tortures, cruel treatments, and the situation of the recruited children whose whereabouts remain unknown. And third, it is important to remember that in all of the methodologies that we implemented in the chamber, we investigate through a pattern-based methodology instead of focusing on isolated acts or perpetrators. This is in order to address the broad scale and scope of the victimization that we have documented. So it is good to remember that within the chamber, we define a criminal pattern as the non-accidental repetition of crimes that are similar in objectives, modes of commission, and victims' characteristics. And these patterns can indicate the policies. And when we talk about policies, we refer to the set of plans and guidelines from the armed structure, whether these are explicit or de facto policies. And this is useful for the chamber to determine these patterns because we can identify those bearing the most of the greater responsibility, considering that they order the explicit or implicit policies guiding the armed organizations' actions. So we strongly believe that this method ensures a broader access to truth compared to focusing on individual acts. And why? Because in a transitional context, as it was presented at the beginning, we have limited resources. In this type of context, not all victims or facts are able to reach the judicial system. And so we focus on illustrative facts and the representative nature in terms of the patterns and in terms of the policy that we can identify. And for that, and using that methodology, we can account for widespread violence. And we think that this can provide justice even to those victims that are not directly involved in the proceedings, but that were affected by similar violence. And this is also, although their individual cases are not investigated, they are addressed in their overarching patterns that encompass their suffering and that we have identified in the case. So this is very basic features of the methodology that we applied. It could be really more complex than that, but I want to finish and to mention several challenges that we faced when we were actually approaching gender-based violence within this context of the life within the ranks of the victims. And particularly from the perspective of the legal analysis that we conducted in the decision that we presented. It is first good to notice that for all the patterns that were gender-based that we have identified it, we examined the coercive environment in which recruited children lived and how it was exacerbated by the gender norms imposed by the FARC, by the group, where girls, women, and individuals with diverse orientation or gender identities suffered a specific form of violence. So first, regarding the pattern of reproductive violence that we found that was committed against recruited girls, we found that for this pattern, it was central, the group's contraception policy. We found that this was documented, they have this formal policy, and it was aimed at preventing parenthood within the ranks to ensure operational continuity and control. We found, for instance, that at least 24% of recruited girls were subjected to forced contraception, while 19% of female victims experienced forced abortions within the ranks. Additionally, in some cases, victims suffered the death of or forced separation of their newborns. And this violence was consolidated through formal directives issued by the FARC's leadership, which established a birth control policy enforced and controlled by the Secretariat, and then it was descended in the ranks. In practice, this policy tacitly prohibited maternity and paternity within the ranks, resulting in systemic reproductive violence against girls and women. These practices completely deprived victims of autonomy over their bodies and decision. We said this in the decision. And also when they used procedures conducted in inadequate health conditions, and this also when causing profound physical and emotional harm to the victims. In this pattern, we included acts of forced contraception, forced abortions, and in some cases, the death and the forced separation of newborns. And this was challenging in order to do the legal qualification because there is no specific war crime that is directly addressed to this type of reproductive violence. So in the chamber, we classified these acts under existing categories of war crimes, and we use the Rome Statute for this. So for instance, the forced contraception was classified as an outrage upon personal dignity. When this forced contraception caused grave suffering and was driven by discriminatory intent against girls, we classified it as torture. And for instance, when forced abortions presented with was represented with the death or separation of newborns, we classified this as torture. And for the death of the newborns, we categorize this as homicide. This is just an example about the first pattern. I'm talking about all the reproductive violence that we found. In terms of the sexual violence that we found, we classified this as a second pattern within the violence that we documented. And we determined that despite the formal guidance within the ranks, within the fact that prohibited sexual violence, we found that no mechanisms for prevention, reporting, or effective punishment of sexual violence were in place within the group. In the victims, according to the reports and the accounts of the victims that are participating, we found that 135 men and women reported sexual violence within the ranks. And we found that from all the participating victims in the case, female victims in the case, 35% of them was subjected to this type of violence. They told us, the victims, that this violence was generally perpetrated by superiors and that there were not effective mechanisms within the group to report and to punish these acts. So these facts led to the chamber to conclude that these practices were tacitly permitted by the commander, including those at the secretariat level that we call to recognize their responsibility. And we said that we found that they were aware of the violence, but failed to implement measures to prevent or to address or to sanction this violence. It is important to notice that within this violence, we found acts such as rape, sexual slavery, forced unions, forced nudity, also other violent sexual acts that we found that occurred systematically across various territories within the group. We also concluded in the chamber that while the evidence established the systemic nature of this act, it was insufficient to affirm that this pattern resulted from a formal or a de facto policy from the FARC. In terms of the legal qualification, we use the Rome Statute again. We classified these acts as war crimes, including rape, sexual slavery, other forms of sexual violence constituting serious violation to Common Article 3, and we included their forced nudity, sexual touching, and harassment, for instance. We also classified this as torture when the elements were met under the Rome Statute. And finally, in terms of the pattern of violence based on prejudice against children with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression, we found or we identified a pattern of prejudice-based violence within the FARC ranks that target children with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. And we found also that this pattern was expressed in a range of violent practices, including death threats, sanction, corrective sexual violence, other forms of mistreatment that inflicted severe suffering to the victims. And we also found this that was very special to the case and to the analysis that we made, that was that it was included the enforced concealment of sexual orientation or gender identity. We found that this occurred systematically across various territories and derived from what we identified as a de facto policy prohibiting individuals with diverse sexual orientation or gender identity or expression from joining the ranks of the FARC. So this policy, we found that was promoted and validated by the...
I think we just have a couple of minutes left on the talk, Judge Reza, if that's okay.
Okay, yeah, I'm finishing.
Thank you.
We found that this was validated and promoted by the highest command, and they created an environment where violent practices aimed at excluding and punishing individuals for their sexual orientation or gender identity. And this was legitimized within the group. We qualified these as war crimes. We included rape, sexual slavery, and we also identified these as corrective sexual violence. And just to finish, I just want to mention that this, you can see how throughout this process in the chamber, we prioritized victims' experiences with particular attention to the gender consideration, and we employed specific methodologies to ensure that their voices were central to the investigation. And by the methodology that we use, when we analyze the explicit and the implicit policies that facilitated these crimes, we believe that the chamber and all the HEP has made significant contributions to transitional justice. We want to believe that we have advanced accountability in this context that is often forgotten, the intra-ranked context. And we have been taking seriously the gender approach, but not only in this case, but also in all the investigative agenda of the HEP, which includes also case 11 that we are going to maybe talk in the Q&A, or I think Judge Oscar Parra is going to talk about this. And because now this is the case in which we are focusing exclusively on gender-based violence, but it comes with some reflection and experiences that came from what we did in case 7, and now we are implementing in this big platform of gender approach that is case 11. And well, thank you very much. I think I took a couple of minutes more. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation, and I learned so much as well, in particular about the methodology of how these cases are concluded and found to be. Up next, we have Judge Oscar Parra, who is also part of the special I'm going to take this word out, jurisdiction for peace. He also has lots and lots of experience in human rights law, and he's presiding case judge for subcase 2 and subcase 3 or macro case 11 of conflict-related gender-based violence, which he's now going to talk us through, including his dissenting opinion on how responsibility is attributed for sexual violence within the ranks. So I'd just like to welcome Judge Oscar Parra.
Thank you very much for having me here. And thank you in particular to Daniela Suarez for this research and this opportunity to talk about this particular topic. And let me begin with some remarks regarding my concurring opinion in the context of the decision that my colleague Judge Lily Rueda explained previously, because in my view it is important to understand the debates and the methodological approaches to these topics regarding violence inside the ranks in the context of an armed organization. My concurring opinion analyze the discussions regarding when we have or the discussions regarding if there is a practice or if there is a tacit policy or de facto policy, or if there is a pattern, or these discussions about the narrative regarding the violence inside the guerrilla of the FARC related to the case number 7. And in particular, I did a concurring opinion considering the next, that the majority of the chamber considered that there is a de facto policy regarding the reproductive violence and regarding the violence by prejudice, but the chamber said that there is no de facto policy regarding the sexual violence. And the majority said that we found a practice, a normalized practice regarding the sexual violence. And my point is that it is important to highlight, to say that there is a de facto policy regarding the sexual violence. And I put in my concurring opinion four reasons or four aspects that, in my view, are important in this topic. I um, I considered in my concurring opinion that, based on the factual and evidentiary basis described in the order, um, it can be stated that there was a de facto policy that tacitly authorized the occurrence of crimes of sexual violence, and in that sense did not obey a mere normalized and permitted practice. And this is important because the majority of the chamber said that the Secretariat of the FARC is responsible only for common responsibility regarding the sexual violence. My point is that it is possible to say that there is a possibility of an attribution of indirect co-perpetration regarding the sexual violence. In my view, there is a huge difference when we say that there is only an omission and only a superior responsibility, and that is a very different to say that there is an involvement in a indirect co-perpetration regarding a tacit a de facto policy regarding sexual violence. I believe that sexual violence can be included in the framework of the common plan that involved the recruitment and use of children, which generated an environment of coercion that had as a necessary consequence the occurrence of sexual violence. In my view, the members of the Secretariat of the FARC were aware of these acts of sexual violence, and in view of this, they would not have acted not only as a mere omission, but also in the knowledge that the acts will continue to be perpetrated and will seriously affect children who were linked to the group. And the point here is that the discussion inside the chamber was strongly associated about the goals or the objectives or the functionality of the sexual violence inside the armed group. That was a very contested issue. In my concurring opinion, I'd say that there are four goals or four objectives or four finalities or four functionalities of the sexual violence against the recruitment children. First, as a mechanism to build or maintain hierarchy inside the troops. I think that I consider that the evidence permitted to say that the different forms of sexual violence committed by the commanders were not due to libidinous acts, but served as a mechanism to build and maintain hierarchy inside the troops. The second idea is that the sexual violence was used as a mechanism to build bonds of union between the troops and in order to construct a subjectivity of warrior masculinity. This is so important because for the case number 11, this is crucial to understand the, the concept of warrior masculinity behind this particular kind of violence. And in that context, sexual violence was functional to strengthen ties of union between the troops through the authorization to dispose of the girls, in addition to reinforcing practices of violent masculinity. The third functionality, the third goals, the third objective is the use of sexual violence as a tool of punishment. In my view, from the available evidentiary material, it can be stated that sexual violence was also a tool of punishment or sanction for failing to comply with internal rules or to guarantee the sexual availability of the victims. In this way, sexual violence exercised through sexual punishment and punishments for not acceding to sexual demands, among others, was functional to build the required obedience in a context fully regulated by the value of discipline as the cornerstone of the organization. And finally, the fourth topic here was the use of sexual violence as a way of maintaining group cohesion and authority. Given that the absence of sanctions did not respond to an isolated situation, but to a condition of possibility for acts of sexual violence to be maintained over time, it is necessary to read this permissiveness in the light of the functionality of the lack of punishment as a way of maintaining cohesion and authority within the group. Because of that, I think that the sexual violence experienced by girls and some boys in their in their time within the ranks of the FARC was not only the result of a policy of regulation of life within the ranks that generated an environment of coercion that led to sexual violence, but it was also functional for the purpose of building hierarchies, loyalty, and obedience of the troops. And because of that, I rejected the um, the conclusion regarding command responsibility, and I thought that there was another possibility for the indictment regarding the indirect co-perpetration. And finally, in 2 minutes, I only want to take 2 minutes to say some lines about the case number 11, because I only want to highlight that we took case number 7 as a bridge, as a starting point for the construction of case 11. And in case 11, we are investigating both the FARC and the public forces. I am in charge of the an specific subcase regarding the public force and in particular the crimes committed by the armed force against civil population. I understand that it is not necessarily the topic of the discussion today, but I would like to highlight that the idea of the whole case number 11 is to have a particular focus on the acts of violence and their motivations, the goals, the objectives of the sexual and gender violence. And the case number 11, it not refer to individual motivations, but rather to those revealed by the logic of armed organizations And this is the particular discriminatory element that we are analyzing in case 11. Um, because of that, we took the same patterns that my colleague, the judge Lily Rueda explained before, and we applied these particular patterns to understand um, the, the gender logics or orders of armed organizations related to gender norms and relations that predominate in our society. And we analyze this warrior masculinity, for instance, in the context of the case number 11. We analyze military discipline. We began with voluntary statements and interrogatories with the military personnel, analyzing what was the meaning or the analysis of male identity within legal or illegal armies, the ways of relating based on stereotypes or meanings associated with what it means to be a man in war, um, the 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 use of uniforms, weapons, power over others in order to develop control over women and the control over the diverse gender identities. And in that context, we applied the frameworks of case number 7 in the context of case number 11. I took these minutes to conclude in this line, and I hope that in the context of the questions, we have the opportunity to explain a little bit more on case 11. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge Para. That was excellent. I really enjoyed the look at strategic violence both within FARC and the functional impunity within the organisation. But I also really appreciated the link to Judgment 11, which looks at army violence, which links very nicely, almost as if it was organised, to Professor Cheryl Lawther's speeches, which is going to look at both paramilitary conflict-related sexual violence, but also state violence, when she looks at silence within, victimhood, female combatants, and conflict-related sexual violence in Northern Ireland. She as well a very, very long academic list of prowess, so I'm not going to list it all out, but she's had key publications in the last year on the truth, denial, and transition, but also on constructing victimhood, so I'd like to welcome her to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Monica, and thank you so much, Daniela, for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. We'll just wait until the PowerPoint comes up here. I'm not going to touch the technology myself. That should be us. Perfect. Okay, so this paper this afternoon is entitled Silence Within, Victimhood, Female Combatants and Conflict-Related Sexual Violence in Northern Ireland. And effectively what I try to do in this paper, which is part of a larger project, we looked at the construction, reproduction and politicisation of victimhood that has arisen as a result of the Northern Ireland conflict. This paper, I suppose, zones in on one specific aspect of victimhood during the conflict here, and that is sexual and gender-based violence and conflict-related sexual violence. And in the paper this afternoon, I am looking specifically at violence experienced by women who were members of the Republican movement. And they experienced that violence in two different ways. Either as a result of sexual violence or conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated by male members of the Republican movement, or sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by state forces on Republican women and female prisoners. And what I'm particularly interested in is looking at how the Republican movement, the Provisional IRA in specific, responded to women's experience of sexual violence. And we're specifically talking about women within the Republican community and within the ranks of the armed movement itself. And what I'm arguing in this paper is that response to both of these forms of sexual violence is one of silence and denial. And that silence and denial is derived from the IRA's attempt to protect its own self-image. So I am going to just skip very briefly over this slide, but you can see a picture here, shamelessly so, of the book that this paper comes out of, so it's easy to identify. But basically what I'm going to do in the presentation is give you a very brief overview of kind of the main patterns of conflict-related sexual violence in Northern Ireland. And think about how armed groups, and particularly the IRA, imagined themselves. And then I'm going to say that that imagination of the IRA maps onto three responses to the experience and allegations of sexual violence within women, within the Republican community and the Republican armed movement itself. So in terms of sexual violence and conflict-related sexual violence in Northern Ireland, there is something of a knowledge gap in terms of the precise number of victims of conflict-related sexual violence. But what we do know, thanks to the work of including people who are actually on this call this afternoon, is that there's four main patterns of violence. As you can see on the screen, that's conflict-related violence perpetrated by paramilitary actors, including sexual violence, conflict-related gender-based violence perpetrated by state forces, including sexual violence, intimate partner violence, where real or alleged paramilitary connections, including the use of weapons, was used to threaten or control or punish and abuse women, but also the double victimization of those who had already been bereaved. So, for example, it is well known that within families, say, for example, the husband or the other male breadwinner passed away as a result of conflict-related harm. Sometimes women and children, particularly young girls, were preyed upon by people with somewhat more nefarious interests in their own communities. There's also evidence of children who lost parents and who entered the industrial school system, who were then bereaved as a result of the conflict and then sexually abused in the residential care system. But as I said, I am focusing on paramilitary non-state armed group perpetrated sexual violence this afternoon. And to kind of zone out for 1 second, it's important, I think, to understand, if we're going to really understand how armed groups respond to sexual violence or engage in sexual violence in their own ranks, then we actually need to understand how that armed group imagines itself. And so I'm attempting to condense what is quite a large literature into about 30 seconds. But basically, if we look at that literature on non-state armed groups and how they imagine themselves, that's about the political ideology of the group. It can often be about like notions of honor and protection. Does the armed group have a particular code of conduct that it says it adheres to at all times? And what about the relationship between that armed group, civilians, other non-state armed groups, other combatants, or even states themselves? And I suppose there's 2 or 3 things that I'm particularly interested in here. The first is the idea that armed groups, particularly non-state armed groups, often engage in a process of state mimicry, where they're basically trying to position themselves as the state and take control over punishment, the ability to exile, the ability to censor, for example. And a part of that is having like a supposed dispute resolution function or a policing function, as we saw and is well known throughout the conflict in Northern Ireland, that both, particularly in the Republican community, but both communities, the armed groups effectively policed their own communities through punishment attacks. And of course, part of this self-imagination is not just necessarily articulating what your ideology is or claiming that you have a code of conduct. By definition, that might also involve silencing or hiding or denying the less palatable aspects of your past and of your present conduct. And that's what we see in respect to sexual violence in Northern Ireland. So to bring this down into how the IRA imagines themselves, if we think about the history, the ideology of the Republican movement, particularly the provisional IRA, the IRA has historically presented itself as like the inheritor of the Republican tradition in Ireland, and it has historically presented itself as like a legitimate government in waiting. Now, you can also, of course, dispute that, but that is how it has imagined itself, and it has imagined itself as something like a state-like entity. And you can see that the Republican movement, from its origins to effectively the present day, has used like a language of stateness to position itself and to justify its own positions. So, for example, the IRA has its own code of conduct. It has a green book that members of the Republican movement were expected to sign up to and to act in accordance with. They claimed, and again, you could dispute this, they claimed they adhered to the laws of war and they engaged in state-like conduct. The IRA claimed, and to some extent was, a very disciplined and organised organisation, and it also controlled justice functions and policing functions within its own community. But it is precisely this language and practice of stateness and this self-imagination of the IRA as this legitimate body that's ready to step into government, that has its own moral and practical code of conduct. It is precisely that self-imagination that has meant it has also had to silence evidence and allegations of sexual violence within its own ranks and within its own communities. And that, most interestingly, I think, also has included sexual violence perpetrated by the British state on Republican women, which you would think would be an easy target for the IRA to respond to. But for reasons that I'll come on to in a moment or two, it hasn't been able to go there. So just to give you some kind of insight into the forms of sexual violence experienced by female combatants and female women members of the Republican community in Northern Ireland. In respect to sexual violence perpetrated by the Provisional IRA, there's a range of different responses, or a range of different forms of sexual violence. That includes the control of women's sexuality. So as you can see on the photograph in the middle of the screen here, it's a mock-up of a woman tied to a lamppost. There is a practice during the conflict in Northern Ireland known as tarring and feathering, whereby women who, for example, may have fallen in love or entered a relationship with a member of the British Army. That was obviously a no-go from a Republican perspective, and a spectacle, a humiliating and painful spectacle, would have been made of her. But also there was the sexual control of women and partners of male members of the IRA who were serving prison time. Who they were allowed to engage in a relationship with was very tightly controlled by the Provisional IRA. The second kind of main form of sexual violence is the rape and sexual abuse of effectively an unknown number of women and men within the Republican community. Two of the most high-profile cases are the case of Maria Cahill, whose picture's at the top of the screen, but also Paddy McGahan in the Republic of Ireland. There's also evidence that when the Republican movement found out, or attention was brought to it in terms of offenders, they exercised their power of, I guess, sovereignty over punishment and policing functions to banish or relocate those offenders. So they basically moved people around the countryside, sometimes, and in a way, actually mimicking their criticism of what the Catholic Church did with offending priests. There was also the covering up of incidents, and sometimes including the literal cleaning up of scenes of rape and other forms of sexual violence. But there is also some evidence to suggest that some men who were perceived to be useful to the Republican cause or good soldiers, they were allowed to stay in the movement because they were good soldiers, and it was his soldiering ability that was put above what he had done to women or girls. On the other hand, though, of course, women who were members of the Republican movement or indeed were imprisoned on allegations of being involved within armed republicanism, they were also subjected to sexual violence on the part of state forces, particularly prison authorities, members of the police and soldiers. And that included things like outside the prison estate, things like physical and sexual harassment during checkpoints or raids on houses and people's homes, but also within the prison estate when women were incarcerated, and men too. There was excessive strip searching. It was obviously justified in the name of security, but there is evidence, I know of at least one particularly high-profile former woman who was in the Republican movement who was strip searched over 400 times in 1 year. And also men were strip searched too, and in a way that was effectively a form of sexual violence. And that was in addition to the physical and sexual harassment of women prisoners while, for example, they were going to the showers, while they were going to get something to eat, while they were in the exercise grounds or out doing like mock parading exercises. And effectively in this context, under the guise of security, conflict-related sexual violence was really used as a way to punish and discipline Republican women. And so the question is, well, how has the IRA how has the provisional IRA responded to both of these forms of sexual violence perpetrated on women within its own constituency? And the first of these ways of response is a complete denial. And that's about protecting the all of these responses are about protecting the self-imagination of the IRA. And in this case, denial, whether that's literal denial, whether it's implicatory denial, a denial of the victim, a condemnation of the condemners, borrowing very heavily from the work of Stan Cohen. It was all about protecting the organizational image as this honorable organization that was held in high regard. So that has meant literal denial of claims and evidence of sexual abuse. It has meant denying the victims, claiming, for example, that women who are abused sometimes actually enjoy it, and sometimes they lead their offender on. Really repulsive stuff. But denial has been like a really key part of that architecture of response. The second response, as I mentioned earlier, circulates or rotates around the idea of the power to punish. And just mimic, and in terms of that idea of state mimicry, the IRA has treated the response to offenders within its own ranks as the responsibility of the organisation itself. So whether that was court-martialing offenders and using kangaroo courts, so basically the IRA presiding over its own forms of justice, creating its own internal courts, where members of the IRA acted as judge and jury, but also with the power to banish, and in some cases the power to execute. Or there was the physical punishment of offenders and expelling of offenders. So just like a state has the power to punish or the state has the power to exile, the IRA took that on in response to sexual violence in its ranks. So it was, of course, a very visible and very tangible response to wrongdoing, but it also reinforced the power to exile or the power to shoot or expel, reinforces those claims to sovereignty and the ability to punish. And I think also being able to exile someone, being able to put somebody out of your community, it really reinforces your idea that you own the territory and you own your citizens. And then secondly, is the part, continuing on from this then, actually, sorry. As I said earlier, the IRA also claimed that they had the authority to protect people who were guilty, but who were important to the cause. So, for example, some people were given immunity. Some women's reports were managed into silence. Sometimes people received a very symbolic physical punishment. I'm not saying a minor flesh wound wouldn't be painful, but it certainly wasn't anything particularly substantive. And maybe in some cases, after the dust had settled, the offender was allowed to reintegrate back into the organization. So again, it's using this veil of stateness to silence critique of the existence of sexual offenders within the organisation, but also to justify how the IRA and themselves responded to those offenders. And then finally, the sort of ultimate response here is this creation of a state of silence. And I suppose that this is the bit that I am most interested in, because if you look particularly like in the sphere of the question of how to deal with the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland, from the earliest days of the peace process, even before that, the Republican movement has put a lot of emphasis not only on the release of political prisoners, but, for example, about seeking justice and accountability for prisoners who were tortured or who are now claiming illness or ill health as a result of the use of CS gas or hazardous cleaning chemicals, for example. But there's an absolute silence from the Republican movement in terms of responding to the victimhood of women who were sexually abused by the British state while in prison. That just does not feature at all in their conversation on how to deal with the past. So they're quite happy to say that men who were victims of torture or men who were victims of like miscarriages of justice or they're ill because of cleaning products or whatever, they're quite happy to claim for truth and justice and accountability in those cases, but they will not turn the same critical eye to the victimhood of their own women. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. There is something of a hierarchy of victimhood within republicanism. One very senior former female member of the Republican movement who was incarcerated during the conflict I'd asked her this question. I said, why is there not the same response to what you experience? And she said, well, at the time in particular, when we were experiencing really harsh conditions in Armagh prison and strip searching was at its height, she said that was the time of the hunger strikes. And she said, we didn't want to take attention away from the hunger strikers. And so they explicitly silenced their own experiences of victimhood. But also, I think from the perspective of like what nationalism is about, if the IRA was to kind of publicize this issue, if it was light was to be shown on their failure to protect like their women, then what would that say about their capacity to protect their community and to like to be the guardian of their community and this sort of rightful moral organization? But also, if the Republican movement was going to to make some noise about the treatment of Republican women at the hands of the British state in terms of sexual violence, then presumably that would automatically lead to a call internally to investigate the sexual violence that the Republican community perpetrated against its own women. So it has been what we've seen is the creation of an absolute state of silence. So just to kind of finish off then, this state of silence has been the result of the protection of the cause of republicanism far ahead of protecting those women and men who have been abused. And that includes victims within the Republican community who were victims of republicanism and victims within the Republican community who are victims of the British state. The silence is equal. But also we then further have to set that in context of the perpetual debate on dealing with the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland. There was new legislation on that last week, and again, conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence completely fall from view. So I'm going to end the presentation on a rather negative note to say that I think that state of silence will continue to perpetuate, but of course the trauma and the harm, physical and psychological, certainly does not diminish with the passage of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawther. I thought that was such an interesting presentation, especially in regards to how they viewed state violence and how that looks in today's reality. I think that's something we're going to take forward, and I look forward to my whole list of questions for everybody involved. Next up, we have Dr. Theresa O'Keefe, who again, long list of academic accolades, including a PhD in political studies from Queen's University in Kingston. She's a feminist sociologist who's deeply committed to feminist practice and public sociology, and has published one of my favourite names of a book, which is The Miniskirt Brigades, Feminist Identity Construction in the Irish Republican Movement. So I'm really excited to welcome her to do her presentation just now.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Daniela, for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation today. What I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to put forward some general reflections, and they're going to map onto what Cheryl was just talking about there. But I've also, there's some really interesting connections to be made between what Oscar and Lily were saying in terms of their findings as well. What I'm going to speak about is based on many years of research within this area. And these include interviews with former women combatants within the Republican movement. It's based on documentary research, as well as my most recent research on gender and the borderlands, women who live in the borderlands on the island of Ireland, and gender-based violence that occurred during the Troubles, and to a certain extent is carrying on today as a result of rebordering practices around border. When I was, I've written a few pieces on gender-based violence during the Troubles and on state violence in particular. And when I started speaking about state violence, it was very taboo. And it's really difficult for me as a sociologist, I find, to go into interdisciplinary spaces or spaces that are at arm's length, say, from sociology. So going into history or law, because the ways in which we talk about conflict-related gender violence or conflict-related sexual violence or sexual violence in general can be different language, and we ask different sets of questions, and the methodologies that we use can be very different. But when I was writing about this, it was seen as a topic that was very taboo. State violence, the state role in the perpetration or sanctioning of gender-based violence during the Troubles. I was accused of being sympathetic to republicanism. I was told by some that I'd gone native because I was talking about the state as a perpetrator of sexual violence. My research, which included testimonies from women who had experienced sexual violence at the hands of the state, was not considered valid precisely because it was the testimonies of women who themselves were combatants. So it was not seen as a valid source of evidence. Scholarship, and this is 15, 20 years ago when I started doing work in this area, it has still been painfully slow to develop. We've seen more research come on stream, important work by Aisling Swain, who is going to be speaking today, by scholars who have really started to advance some work in this area as Rina Wahiden, Niall Martin, for example. But it's still really, really slow. And we very little on loyalist paramilitaries in particular. Much of the research around this relates to women within Republican communities. And part of the reasoning behind this is because for a long time, there was an assumption that Northern Ireland was exceptional, that sexual violence or gender-based violence in the context of the conflict didn't really happen in Northern Ireland to the extent that it happened elsewhere across the world. And these were racialized kind of mindsets as well. And also a product of unresolved legacies of colonialism on the island that relate to taboos around bodies and being able to talk about sexual violence. And also then, I guess, for me as a sociologist, one of the important things that I have to consider before I start talking about what is gender-based violence or conflict-related sexual violence, we need to define that. And we don't really have still, despite the years of international scholarship within this area, we still don't have a really good language for talking about the continuum or the broad spectrum of conflict-related gender violence or gender violence more generally. I liked the concept of a continuum. That's what I've used in my research. And I think it's really important to make parallels between the seemingly everyday forms of gender-based violence and how this connects to the more extreme or severe forms that we're more likely to read about in scholarship on conflict-related gender violence. We still don't have the right language. Oftentimes we're wrapped up in kind of a numbers game and what's kind of come out of this is kind of a hierarchy of harms, I suppose, as well. And this too has hampered how we have looked at or not looked at gender-based violence in Northern Ireland. So I suppose if you ask, what does it look like? The shorter answer is we really don't know yet. We have some, pieces of the jigsaw, but we're missing lots of pieces of the puzzle. And I talk about this in my article on policing unruly women. And within that piece, I talk about the different types of violence that were used or weaponized by the state during the Troubles, that they rested on a continuum, and that the seemingly innocuous forms of everyday violence that women may have encountered on the street were part and parcel of the more severe forms of violence that women experienced, for example, when they were incarcerated in prison. So violence was very much, I've argued, embedded within the state's logic of control. It was a means of controlling or punishing unruly women, as the title of my article states, but it was also a means of communicating with leadership of the IRA, of communicating with the wider Republican community as well. And there were a number of different forms of gender-based violence that the state enacted, and Cheryl went over a lot of those classifications there. But in the first instance, it was through, say, routinized everyday forms of gendered violence, harassment. So encountering the state was a regular occurrence, daily basis, going to the shops, picking your kids up from school. And as part of this, you were subjected to routine searches, going to shopping malls, being in your car. This is a normal part of everyday life. So women were constantly in contact with state forces. And as part of this, women encountered intimidation, harassment, sexual harassment, and threats by security forces. Women from Republican communities were also under extreme levels of surveillance, whether it's through kind of watchtowers in rural areas or in urban centers as well. And this information was used against women and in checkpoints, for example. And they faced violence through the militarization of everyday spaces in the domestic sphere as a result. Raids in homes, when soldiers, security forces entered homes and used sexual threats and other forms of sexual violence as a means to, it was weaponized to bring fear into that space. And it was also very much part and parcel of arrest and detention. Women brought into security huts in random areas, rural areas at night and alone, brought into detention centers. And most notably, the one that we know most about is the violence that took place in prisons. It was more easy to track that, thanks primarily to the reports from women themselves. And this came about not through, as Cheryl says, the Republican movement per se, or the Republican leadership, but it came through as a result of women prisoners themselves writing about their experiences, talking about their experiences. Some of the more graphic detail that we have about sexual violence that took place in prison came through places like Women's News, which was a monthly magazine published by the women's movement in the North, and their testimonies were carried through in the pages of Women's News, the letters that women used to write from prison. And the state used techniques that were typically associated with interpersonal sexual violence in service to the prison system as a means of, as Rita Segato says, expressive violence, where the body becomes a site for a message to the community. You know, as Oscar was saying, it's like a warrior masculinity. It's a message to the brotherhood, you know, on behalf of the state. Ruth Serfit says it's male communication. It's an exercise in masculinity to the opponent group. So it was an attempt, there was two things at play. It was an attempt to undermine republicanism, to weaken it within the public domain, to weaken its perception, to communicate to Republican leadership as well. But it was also used as a means to police women who dared to use their agency. And again, I detail that out in my work, and I don't have time to go into it today. But in terms of the reaction then and how it shaped Republican strategy, well, in the first instance, state violence motivated more women to join the IRA. And we're not just talking about gender-based violence here, we're talking about the killing and maiming of children, the use of children as shields. And as a reaction to this violence, women, and as one woman in one of my interviews said, we wanted to shift from being ladies in waiting toward becoming equal combatants as a result of this. And many men in the movement really grappled with women's increased presence in the army. But women they dismissed them as unenlightened dinosaurs. But the male-dominated movement was really nervous about this. They were worried about how it would impact public sympathies for the campaign. And then this became really pronounced during the time of the prison struggles. And gender-based violence created quite a few fissures within the movement. And this had a series of effects. It propelled women to organize and resist and even reject orders from the leadership. So, for example, women went on a hunger strike in 1980, despite the Republican leadership not wanting them to do so. And this was a response to state violence that was taking place within the prisons.
Dr. O'Keefe, just a wee note to say a couple more minutes, if that's okay.
Okay, that's great, Monica. Thank you. And women became an integral part of the prison campaigns, and they had some of the more successful, if I might say, campaigns through their actions. And yet these were minimized for the reasons that Cheryl outlines. Republican leadership was squeamish about women's involvement in prison struggles, not only for fear of negative publicity, but it threatened Republican masculinity. Men felt, and many male former prisoners reported that they felt like it was a reflection on their inability to protect women. The poor wee girls was the common kind of phrase that was used. And how weak were they that the women themselves had to go on strike and join these protests, the no wash protests, the hunger strike, because the men weren't strong enough to do it on their own. And so women were bad publicity in that sense. Agentic women were bad publicity. And there was also a failure then to acknowledge this within the movement. The Republican movement, as Cheryl says, were really silent on this, but Republican women were not. And what resulted from this, and I know I'm out of time here, is that it shaped Republicanism to the extent that a Republican feminism emerged. And within this, at its core, was a critique of state violence, which was different than other types of feminism that were emergent on the island at this time. Solidaristic relationships were formed, not with male comrades to a certain extent, but with other feminists, where they found solidarity around the prison campaigns, around state violence. This, in effect, shaped party politics. It shaped the politics within Sinn Féin, which adopted more liberal positions around things like domestic violence, and at one time abortion. They developed their own women's department. So there were negative consequences, of course. There's a lot of trauma that's yet to be reckoned with, but there are also interesting elements of women being radicalized as feminists as a result of their experiences with gender-based violence as well. I've only touched on a few reflections, but hopefully there'll be space to tease some of that out in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Keefe. That was really, really excellent. And I really enjoyed the development of Republican feminism. I think that's such an interesting perspective. I have, not for the first time in my life and not for the last, I have overpromised and underdelivered. We no longer have 10 minutes to do questions. We only have 5. So I would like to ask the floor if there's any questions, either from online or... Oh, there's a mic. Here, I'm about to overpromise again. So we'll be asking some questions from the floor. Whilst we wait for the microphone, if I could just... Oh, the microphone's here already. I don't have time for more questions. So would anybody like to start? Oh, Kevin over there, Dr. Herty.
Thanks. Those were all fascinating papers, and the core sort of theme of gender and sexual based violence run through it. But kind of, I guess I have a question for Cheryl and Teresa that sort of touches on two things that they said. So I guess kind of yes, on one level, the issue of conflict related sexual violence has only came out during the legacy debate and the idea that it's been hidden. But to play devil's advocate, has it really been hidden? Was it really hidden? I mean, there were aspects of state violence particularly within the prison, sexual violence within the prison that were known about from the 70s, from the 80s. Elements of the women's movement rejected championing that issue on the basis that of the political background of the victims. Middle of the road parties, particularly one that's doing quite well in the polls in the moment, liberals in institutions like this, knew about the continuing state violence. They denied the reality of sexual violence committed by the state as much as they denied Bloody Sunday, as much as they denied Shoot to Kill, as much as they denied collusion on the basis of condemning the condemner. So we don't like the claim, or we don't like the person that's making the claim, ergo we will deny that it happens. So is it really as hidden as we think, or is that an easy position?
We'll just like to, who would like to go first? Dr. O'Keefe or Professor
Oh,
Lothar?
Teresa's going to go first.
Okay, Dr. O'Keefe, on you go.
Thanks, Kevin. And I mean, this is, you've raised a really important point, and this is one of the other key areas that I've written about at a piece come out 2 years ago called Bridge Builder Feminism on exactly this issue. People knew what was happening in the prisons. I mean, the campaign around gender-based violence in the prisons was international. There was support from the UK, there was support from Canada, there was support from New Zealand and Australia. People like Margaretta Darcy went into the prisons to in solidarity in Armagh with the women who were incarcerated at the time. But as I call them in my own work, mainstream feminists, so feminists that were involved that were active in Northern Ireland at the time, operated, a lot of organizations operated a lowest common denominator kind of politics approach. And it was kind of leave your contentious issues at the door. So in an attempt to build a movement, there was a broader feminist movement. There was a rejection of talking about so-called divisive issues. Now, this just wasn't about state violence as well. Issues like abortion and issues like issues that faced the queer community were not welcome in these broader spaces. But it's especially noted as time passes and the feminist movement develops, even adopting, a so-called intersectional approach. Even within the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, there was a shying away from addressing what had happened at the hands of the state. So, yeah, I 100% agree with you in that reflection.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily a case of saying that nobody knew about this or like sexual violence was hidden. I think it was actually screaming in the dark, basically, in the sense that people knew. But what I'm critiquing is the response of the Republican movement has been one of silence. So it absolutely 100% knew what was going on and indeed perpetrating it themselves in the community, but their response has been one of silence. So I don't think, some of the darker aspects were perhaps less, not darker, you can't make a distinction, but some of the stuff like the kind of pedophiles, for lack of a better word, like operating within vulnerable communities, that was probably less public knowledge. But certainly like women being harassed at checkpoints or during house raids or sexual violence in the prisons, that was absolutely known. It's just the response is like one of silence.
From other people as well, bystanders. So it's the silence of Republicans, but also the silence of bystanders. So whenever we get onto the broader structural, we can't just say, yes, silence from the perpetrators, but from liberal elites who are also silent. So by extension, that are also have complicity in creating the culture.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that culture of complicity goes much further than this one issue. One question.
Yeah, we're just going to ask if there are any more questions from the floor. We just have time for one more, if that's possible.
Yeah, thanks so much. This was really interesting. I was wondering, I guess from Teresa and Cheryl and also Daniela, if you could, how the women that you've talked to that have experienced this sort of participating in these kind of movements and also have experienced violence, how they engage with the victim label and identity, and if they how they kind of balance, and if the fact that maybe they want to highlight other more agentic parts of their experience more than victimhood, how that influences how they're seen more generally.
I suppose it's one of the questions in part that I grapple with in my book because, and this could be an extremely long answer, so try to be really quick. Obviously, people move throughout different identities, and sometimes people prefer different labels, right? So one day you might feel a victim, the next day you might feel more closely associated with being a survivor. The next day you might be, no, I'm really proud of my identity as a former member of an armed group. So none of those identities are static over the life course. We're in a really interesting position here that the legal definition of a victim of the Northern Ireland conflict is an inclusive definition of the conflict, and it does not discriminate in terms of how you came to be a victim. So legally, those women are victims of the conflict, as are men. That's been hugely problematic because, as Daniela was describing in the Colombian context, as here we are still very much attached to, it's very difficult to shift the dial on understandings of innocent and ideal victims. And particularly, I think that becomes even more difficult when you talk about female combatants, because women who've joined armed groups, as Daniela can speak to much more than I, are often seen as transgressing gender norms and sort of being outside the stereotypical image of what a woman should be. So I think that puts women in a double bind. But maybe Daniela, you want to come in on that?
And we were also wondering if you could ask the same question to the judges, if Judge Aweda or Judge Para would like to speak about the difficulties in working with ex-combatants who were also victims.
Yeah, I think Judge Oscar, he had to leave. I just saw a message saying that he had to leave, but I don't know, maybe Judge Lily, would you like to add something else in relation about how victims in macro case 7 probably have deal with both kind of agency and victimhood identity in the macro case? If not, I'm happy to try to answer some of the questions.
That sounds great. So we'll just give Judge Lily a wee chance.
Hey, can you hear me there?
Yes, perfect. Sorry, Judge Lily, there you go.
Yeah, I was actually saying goodbye in the chat because I thought the conversation to continue. But now that I have a couple of minutes, not only to say goodbye, but to make a brief reflection on this that you are asking me. It is very complex. What I have found in the case that after talking with we have now participating in the case more than 1,500 victims, individual victims. And but also we have people that we called comparecientes, who are the defendants, in the case. And what we have found is that they were also recruited when they were kids. And when I say kids, I'm talking about they were minors of age, 17, 16, 15. For us, technically, this is recruitment of children. And when we talk to the defendants as well, they tell us a lot of histories about how they were victims of violence within the ranks. What is the difference? That one group considers that they were affected by the group, by the violence, and they want to access to justice. They want to demand the rights that they have as victims. And when we talk to comparecientes, for instance, even if they suffer similar things, they have this loyalty to the group, and they have a political project that is linked to the demobilization, to the peace process, and they would never refer to themselves as victims of recruitment or victims of inter-ranked violence, and less victims of gender-based violence. And this is so, at least in the case that I'm dealing with, very clear, and it's complicated only in few cases. I have few cases in which a person is a victim, recognized that access to the justice because they wanted, because they asked, they said, I consider myself a victim, but they are also a perpetrator, like former perpetrator in the case. So I think what we have come to analyze here is the loyalty to the group, not only the violence that they suffered and the fact that they were recruited when they were kids. So it's very complicated because also, as Daniela was presented at the beginning, we have legal framework, victim terms of access, demobilized perpetrators or people or guerrilla or former guerrilla have other access to other public policies. So we are in these discussions now. But just to tell you that at least in this case, the issue of the loyalty to the group and the political perspective of the person, it's very important in the definition of whether the person consider themselves victims or not only the facts that they suffered, because we have witnessed this in the case. And I just want to say congrats, Daniela, on the conversation. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think it was a really, really interesting conversation, like seeing all these points that are coincident within Colombia and Northern Ireland. And please let me know how the conversation goes on and the research, because I will be very interested in using the findings in the analysis that we are doing and the case 7 and also in case 11 in the intra-ranks violence within the FARC group and also military forces that we didn't talk about it, but we also
Definitely, I will do that. And thank you to you, like for giving me time. Like I know how busy is the agenda of both you and Oscar. So thank you for giving some time to attend here and also to kind of like to share I think like the good practices from the HEB in relation to these very complex type of cases. So thank you so much, and I don't take more time from you. So you're free to leave anytime. now, but thank you. And I think probably just to add in relation to the Colombian case, like for your question, I think it's very similar to what already Judge Lily also said, but at least from the research point of view, what I have seen, especially like in scholarship of like some researchers that have worked more directly with female fighters in Colombia, especially with FARC women, there is kind of like now kind of like a resurgence of, or well, not resurgence, but kind of like a reframing of their female experience within the FARC as insurgentas or insurgent feminism, in which they try to make a lot of emphasis on that kind of like emancipatory or like feminist approach in relation to resist army and political resistance too, and trying to frame their experience within the FARC very into those kind of like ideas. I think it's very similar to what Teresa was mentioning in relation to some like kind of like feminist approaches from Republican women. But I think the problem with some of these women that I also have discussed it with some of the scholars that are working on this topic is that they usually tend to exclude those other women that have come forward and have reported these cases. And they want to set, like they're very straightforward in separating themselves from those women that have reported the cases. They said like either the case, they either blame the victims by saying like that didn't happen, or we are women that are carrying guns, or like that we have guns and we like sexual violence or like sexual harassment would have never happened because we were capable enough like to shoot a man or like a comrade that would have tried to approach us. So they have set kind of like a very strict difference between both victimhood and agency in some way, and they want to detach completely, and their agendas are very focused on political reintegration, so separating a lot like this framing of victimhood in relation to them. And yeah, again, kind of like a very strong relation about like the loyalty to the group. So kind of like if they kind of like bring forward these type of ideas, it will kind of like stain a bit like the image, the public image of the group, kind of like their intentions of peace building and kind of like that reconstruction of the public imaginary of the FARC. So yeah, probably just to summarize that. But I think now we can go to probably like 5 minutes of breaks. If you want, you can go out for some coffee. And I think like the people online just connect again like in 5 minutes, and we continue with the next panel that is about reproductive violence and coercive control in Colombia and Northern Ireland.
Hello, Trini, can you hear me?
She would not be afraid of it.
She wouldn't be afraid of it. But there could be other ones
Who would be?
who would be, maybe.
Can you hear me, Trini?
And yet again, like it. Like the public and just I didn't get shit instances critical of the Catholic Church. Like we would have made it like.
Okay, so
So like.
the next section, I'm going into the English channel. Okay. I'm now in the English channel.
Are you able to hear me now?
Are those slides going to be available to the people in participants?
Need to ask them. So I'm just go ahead, Trini.
Yeah.
Are you able to hear me now, Declan? Are you able to hear me now?
Yeah, there's a bit of background noise, but I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. It will hopefully be better once they start and the background noise is finished. It's
Right,
gone.
okay. Well,
Okay.
I'll just wait until people move out a bit.
Yeah. But I would love to do more on it. I really genuinely.
I thought you were spinning it out as an article.
No, I finished the book. It's in book, so it's part of a chapter. So it was like, oh. It was a thesis. Yeah. I had thought of like doing more, and I was like, nah. It just ran out.
No, it's a how you spin an article out.
It always is. That was our plan. Anne-Marie and I like did a piece on silence. It's actually silence. Silence now the self-imagination of the Catholic Church or the Irish state or our institutional abuse. So it's coming that way.
So the self-imagining is with people that constantly claim the moral high ground, whether it's an non-state armed group or a
The church, or the
yeah,
state,
so there is
yeah.
that, and there's also
Yeah.
like Kieran always talks about the Irishness of the Irish
Yeah.
Imagining community. There's definitely that's where we're just going to put that social humor.
Yeah, JLSA. Yeah. No, for just for the publication, we're not. I don't think we're going to go for journal funds. No. Well, I did put my book. They wanted a new books.
Jesus, absolutely.
So I put the book. I said I'd come. I said I'd come for that. I've got to drink this morning or something.
No, it isn't. It's nothing is ever. I'm still trying to find a reason to get that, and or then beg some people the money.
I don't know. Do you still get the?
Okay, go ahead, Trini.
Can you hear me now, Declan?
Yeah, I can hear you now. It's
One,
just a wee
two,
bit
three.
faint. Just
1, 2, 3. 1 second. Is that better now?
yeah, it's just as long as I've got a bit of silence in the room, I should be okay.
Okay, great.
It's just
Thank
some
you.
people got quite booming
you-
voices.
Sure. Do you want to test Miriam's sound as well, please?
Do what, sorry?
Can you please test Miriam's sound as well, just to be sure everything's okay? She'll
So does that
come
mean
on.
I need to go into the English channel? No, or sorry,
Yeah.
Spanish channel. Okay.
No, you can stay in the English channel. She'll move to the English channel for you.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead, Miriam. I can't hear Miriam if she's talking.
Sorry, I think she's in the Spanish channel.
Okay.
You can click there.
I think Trini said to stay in the English channel, and Miriam's going to move. Yeah.
I think like otherwise, like we can just stream it here, like in the English channel.
Hello, can you hear me now? This is Miriam.
Hi, Miriam. Yeah.
Yes, I was speaking in the Spanish channel for you to hear, but you didn't need me to hear there. It's just the people online who need to, anyone who needs the interpretation in Spanish, and we sent them the instructions.
Okay, that's
they
great.
should be able to hear us. So, but I suspect you can also go into the Spanish channel. You may have to be with earphones, but it's not a problem if you don't. I mean, mainly the room has to be in the English channel.
Yeah. Okay.
And the listeners, the people who listen to us online for the Spanish, will be connected through the instructions we gave them.
I'm struggling to hear you because there's a lot of background noise, unfortunately.
I'm just saying that if people need to hear us when people listen to us from English into Spanish, they know what to do because we send them the relevant instructions.
Yes, of course.
Okay, cool. Over and out.
Okay, over and out.
So we go back to the original audio. Like this is what you have to explain to them. So there is that audio where And that's where they can access to their English and Spanish.
Okay.
So the people want
The N. Okay, the N icon. Okay.
So there will be kind of like a globe, like a
Mhm.
map for them, and they can pick they want to hear in English and Spanish, because Alejandra is gonna make her presentation in Spanish.
Well, so they can't hear me right now?
I think they can.
Yeah.
Well, then we explain that for you guys.
But you can. I feel like you can start. Okay.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Are you talking to Trini?
Yeah, just.
We can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So we were just talking about so we're gonna have a live translation. So if you have any questions as to how to do it, there's like this little icon that says interpretation that's in the shape of like a globe. So if you click there, you would be able to choose the channel, whether you want to be on the English channel, on the Spanish channel. We're going to have like a live translation, because one of our speakers is going to deliver her presentation in Spanish. And for those of you who are here, I think you can access the translation via headphones. So if you guys have like your AirPods or any headphones with you, you can do that as well. I'm not entirely sure how would that work. Are they going to like just connect to
You connect on your phone.
Okay.
The same process, except not on
Oh, okay.
a PC, just on your phone.
Okay, so just on your phone, then you can access, because one of our speakers, as I said, is gonna deliver her presentation in Spanish. So welcome. We are a little bit we're a little bit behind of time, but so I'm just gonna make this quick. So this is the second panel, Beyond Sexual Violence, Recognizing Gender Coercive Control and Reproductive Violence Against Women Fighters. My name is Diana Ortega. I am a last year PhD student at the School of Law. Not even last year, like last 3 months. Just racing to finish my thesis, and I'm really happy to be here and to recognize some of the scholars that are gonna present today, because they're part of my lit review, especially Professor Eschling Swine. Hi, Professor, nice to meet you. So today we're gonna start with Cristina Rosero, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to read quickly her bio. So Cristina Rosero is a senior legal advisor for the Center for Reproductive Rights. She's a lawyer from the University of Nariño in Colombia, with a specialization in procedural law from the National University of Colombia, and she has a master's in human rights, globalization, and democracy from the Open University of Catalunya in Spain. She works in civil society organization, and her work has focused on human rights advocacy, particularly sexual and reproductive rights, and the protection of victims and survivors of gender-based violence. She currently serves as a senior legal advisor at the Center for Reproductive Rights, where she leads litigation and advocacy strategies to protect reproductive autonomy in Colombia and across Latin America and the Caribbean. So you can find her work addresses issues such as, some of the issues that we're going to talk about today: reproductive violence during armed conflict, including forced abortion, sterilization, and the impact in reproductive health of, I'm gonna mispronounce this word probably, glyphosate spraying under Colombia's drug control policies. So thank you so much for being here with us, and I'm gonna let you lead the way.
Sorry to interrupt, Christina. If you want to share slides, or if you have any slides that you would like to share, you're free to do it, like in the option of Zoom there to share your screen. So you can do it now.
Yes, thank you. I don't have slides. I rather, since we have only 10 minutes, I thought it was better to share my presentation like this. And thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for these interesting perspectives that we've been hearing all morning here in Colombia. Well, since we already heard from judges from the HEP, and particularly we're going to hear also from Alejandra Alemán from Women's Link Worldwide after my intervention, I want to stop a little bit on the which have been the cases within the armed groups in Colombia, such as FARC. But rather, I'm going to share with you a little bit of our experience on documenting and visibilizing reproductive violence in Colombia. And particularly, I think it would be important for us to share another part of the experience in Colombia, which was the fact that the Truth Commission, another transitional justice mechanism created by the Peace Accord of 2016, recognized reproductive violence and how it was conceptualized by this entity, and which are the impacts of that work before. So as we mentioned before, as we heard before, reproductive violence against women and girls has been largely invisible. We had a long history, particularly from feminist groups, from having a really well-documented experience on the sexual violence against women and girls and other forms of gender-based violence, but not necessarily there was a focus on particularly the violations of reproductive autonomy. And as the Center of Reproductive Rights, we are a global organization working on the recognition of reproductive autonomy as a human right that all states should recognize and protect. We found the possibility of checking how many violations of reproductive rights in the conflict of Colombia were occurred, and how it would be better for them to be recognized, having this opportunity during after the Peace Accord of having transitional justice mechanisms that had the possibility to frame this and to bring this to attention. We worked back in 2020 working on a study that started conceptualized and documented reproductive violence within the armed conflict in Colombia, and also trying to reflect on the possibilities of a new category regarding reproductive violence, especially because we saw that even though we had documentation of cases of reproductive violence, usually these are cases that are framed only as sexual violence. And in some cases, for example, forced sterilizations, forced contraceptions, these weren't cases that were framed on the sexuality of the victim rather than a reproductive autonomy. And it was perpetrated trying for them to control their capacity to decide on those type of cases. So we were working not only in the research of this type of conduct, but also we made advocacy before the Truth Commissions. The Truth Commission finally recognized reproductive violence. Is the first Truth Commission in the history that recognized this category. And right now, the center is working in collaboration with partner organizations in Cauca, Nariño, Santander, and Norte de Santander. That includes the Catatumbo regions, who are regions particularly affected by the conflict by now. And we seek to advance in transformative reparations, community strengthening, and the implementations of these cases. For us, in the first study that we developed on this, we defined reproductive violence as any violations of a person's ability to decide whether or not to have children and when, as well as their access to the information and reproductive health services necessary to make those decisions effective. This was the first definition that the Center for Reproductive Rights developed, and we started this revision on all the cases that were documented. We reviewed more than 150 reports with documentation of gender-based violence made by several entities and civil society organizations. And we realized that at least 68 of those reports brought attentions to certain cases regarding reproductive rights violations. For example, we found cases of forced contraception, particularly within the FARC-EP, particularly with women who were part of the group. and particularly with girls and adolescents who were recruited forcibly. Also forced sterilization, more in the cases of paramilitary groups, particularly with civilians. Forced pregnancies and forced motherhood in several cases, also involving the armed forces from Colombia. Forced abortion, of course, within the FARC-EP, but not only in those groups, also in paramilitary groups and other armed groups locally, not only to control their capacity, reproductive capacity, but also regarding to create terror or to create forms of control within communities. It was a extreme way of violence that looked for create a control against the community. Also, we found cases of torture during pregnancy, and also we managed to include other cases that we consider institutional reproductive violence. For example, the denial of access to legal abortion, even though it was legalized in Colombia and it should be provided to several women. We found cases where this denial caused difficulties to and of course, consequences to the autonomy and the rights of women who faced it. And also involuntary cases, cases of involuntary abortions caused by the use of glyphosate in fumigations that were conducted by the state within an anti-drug policy that was supported by the US government. These fumigations were made through rural areas without any type of previous study on the damages that could cause to the health of people and communities and the environment. And those cases cause harm to reproductive health, not only with miscarriages, but only infertility and other cases. And there weren't any measures to prevent damages to people who were affected by them. So we brought this work to the Truth Commission in 2020. Actually, we organized a hearing called Reproductive Violence in Our Conflict, Appending Truth. The Truth Commission actually had a gender working group that made possible to create these spaces to hear from victims of reproductive violence. And we co-organize this space with other organizations such as Women's Link Worldwide, Corporación Humanas, and universities to contribute to this. This was really significant because the Truth Commission gathered at least 912 testimonies from women victims of sexual violence in Colombia, but 36 of these were related specifically to forms of reproductive violence. The Truth Commission in the final report actually included the category of reproductive violence, and particularly in the chapter which is called My Body is the Truth, Experiences of Women and LGBTQI Persons in the Armed Conflict, included this definition that it can be read like this. Reproductive violence refers to any action or omission aimed to affecting, in one hand, women's right to make decisions about their reproductive lives, and in the other hand, their health in relation to the reproductive capacity or the integrity of their reproductive organs. They recognize several patterns of reproductive violence in the conflict. For example, forced contraception and sterilizations, forced pregnancy.
Sorry to interrupt you, Christina. We just have like 1 or 2 more minutes to wrap this up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So in the final recognitions that the Truth Commission made, they acknowledged this type of violence, but they also asked for, in relation with the Elena case that we'll be hearing about after, they recognize that former combatants should be recognized as victims, and they are entitled to full reparations, and they ask for the changes in the legal scope to create this possibility. Also, to improve access to sexual and reproductive rights in rural areas affected by the armed conflict, and recognize and address the harm caused by aerial spraying with glyphosate, including those reproductive health impacts that affected rural women particularly. So we wanted to bring this experience to maybe set a precedent that definitely for us created the possibility, for example, for the advances that we already heard from the HEP. We believe that the work of the Truth Commission was instrumental to achieve the possibility to having this conversation right now in the jurisdiction for peace. And the other part is that we are launching probably in the next year a special study on how the Truth Commission achieved these recognitions and how the collaboration between the feminist movement, the organizations, the academy was really important for the Truth Commission to become with this type of advances. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was very thorough, and I appreciate that you were very quick in your presentation, but also without sacrificing the content. Thank you so much. We are going to follow by Professor Aisling Swain from University College Dublin. Can you hear us, Professor?
I can, yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So should I skip the introduction to you? If you don't mind, Professor, we might, skip the introduction so you can have more time. So Professor Aisling Swain from University College Dublin is going to follow up. I'll allow you. There you go. So you can have more time for your actual presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just trying to share my screen. So here we go. Hang on. Hold on.
Perfect. We can see it.
Can you see all good?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Okay. And I will try my best to stick to 10 minutes. Thank you, Diana, and thank you. I look forward to meeting you someday and hear more about your work. And thanks to Daniela for the invitation today. I certainly will be building on the reflections shared by Teresa earlier and Cheryl. I share certainly Teresa's experience. I was told 20 years ago I was completely mad for trying to identify conflict-related violence in a setting like Northern Ireland. So I'm building on about 20 years of work here, but very much talking today about contemporary debates and contemporary experiences of harm related to the Troubles. Daniela had asked me if I would talk about my more recent work on this idea of paramilitary-related coercive control. I'm going to do my best to do so. This comes from very complex research, and I have 10 minutes to give you a hop, skip, and jump through it. So forgive me, I'm offering a partial representation, and I hope it makes sense. I'm going to give you some of the motivations and starting points for the research, a little bit of the key findings that came out of it, and why this is something we might need to be talking about today. Part of the body of work I've been involved in for some time is really about expanding how we conceive of the idea of conflict-related harm. It has very much been located in globally, for sure, in the idea of conflict-related sexual violence, which people have been talking about. And I felt at a certain point that we've really gone down narrow frames of reference, like the legalistic turns, medicalized approaches to looking at women's bodies, a quantitative turn towards looking at causality of armed group violence, but all very much focused on specific incidents and acts of violence. And I wanted to push our field of thinking beyond sexual violence. It's still needed in many locations, including in Northern Ireland, as we've already heard. But I really am motivated by looking at the experiences women have of less observationally evident harm, which brought me to this idea of coercive control. Part of the starting point here is to build on decades of work by other scholars in Northern Ireland, and I want to make sure and acknowledge that. Brilliant work, and I think foremost in the world, really. I work globally on these issues, and the linkages between conflict and intimate partner violence has really been foregrounded here in Northern Ireland. And I just, Monica McWilliams McKiernan and Monica and Jessica Doyle's study more recently show us a lot on that. We've had then this consistent idea at a political level of, do we really still understand paramilitarism? And the Independent Reporting Commission have pointed us just recently on the need to understand this more. There's been significant documentation by many NGOs and academics, and I think Colin Walsh is speaking later. His work has been instructive for me on looking at what paramilitarism looks like today. And the Fresh Start Agreement has pointed us towards looking at, is coercive control a way to understand paramilitarism? And so that was kind of my starting point of all these people using this term. And what does it mean actually for women if we start using the term coercive control? So I began this study between 2020 and 23 with Foyle Women's Aid in Derry, Londonderry. We interviewed almost 30 people around experiences of contemporary paramilitarism with a lens of looking at what coercive control might be or mean for these women. So I'm going to share with you a little on that. I can share more on the methodology if there's questions. I just want to skip through to the content. I will say that I was a bit reserved at the outset with using the term coercive control in this context. I didn't want to dilute the term because it has been conceived of in the field of domestic violence for very specific terms and in very specific ways. And so we can't just take an idea like this and plonk it onto a much more diffuse context, if you like. But I started there and I started looking at why then all of these scholars and policymakers might use this term. I also bring into consideration the concept of social control. So for me, the social control dynamics of paramilitaries at community levels and how that intersects then with the idea or possibility of coercive control, either at community level, but also into the home. And that relationship between the street and the home has been something that's featured in a lot of the study in Northern Ireland and elsewhere on violence against women. But I think a lot of assumptions about what those connections are. And so I really wanted to explore that. I'm going to share with you a series of quotes from women that came from this research to show why I've gone in the direction I've gone in. Some of these are quite hard to read, so just to say that. So here's one of the first interviews I did that really signaled to me that, oh, there was more here than I actually had envisaged. We have a real threat of paramilitaries, you know, your life basically. That's a hell of a lot more scary than just one man, one individual who's trying to coerce you. You're talking about a heavy, heavy, scary group. So that's one. And then there was another very instructive, sorry, I'm trying to move ahead. I'm sorry, juggling the, there, I think it's going, okay. Juggling between Zoom and the PowerPoint, apologies. So this was another very instructive quote for me. You're scared for your life, but it's not just one person, it's a whole organization. With domestic abuse, you have you and your abuser. But with an abuser that's in an organization, you have them and all the people that come along with them. So that gave me pause because I thought, are we really understanding what it feels like for a woman to be in this context of abuse in her home, but absolutely and wholly related to a wider dynamic that's been a sustained dynamic in Northern Ireland in these communities where paramilitaries are present? So I can't go into this in detail. I found this coercive power model, which tries to explain coercive control in a domestic abuse setting. I took it and I adapted it to a broader context of social control and coercive control in an environment like Northern Ireland. I came up with this very complicated model. I don't have time to go into it. The research is published. I hope you can read it. I'm going to give you a hop, skip and a jump of 3 of the examples of this. But for me, the context background was setting out much of what Teresa offered earlier on the context to the troubles and lack of recognition and acknowledgement of gendered harm, and what is meant then for today and women's experiences. So out of this model, for example, key has been stage setting. Paramilitaries have positioned themselves as community. There's no alternatives. You have to deal with them regardless of what's happening at community level. That places women in a position of having to operate and live within that kind of environment. So that quote there says it all, that for women, he sets the stage and lets her know, I'm in the paramilitaries. This is another level to the abuse that's going on here. At another stage of this model of how coercive control operates, there's this demand and threat that goes on. The implicit presence of paramilitarism in the background of who he is. And then he uses that in explicit ways, actually, and tactically, and tells her, do you know, I can get the boys down. If you ever open your mouth, you'll get a bullet to your head. And so there's this tacit presence of paramilitarism. It's always latent. And then the tactical use of it when he wants to exert the demand and the threat that characterizes coercive control. This is a very instructive one for one woman who was in a very violent relationship. At one point, he had shown her he has a gun. He had told her over and over he's part of one of the paramilitary groups. He took me up a back lane and told me to sit there because he was going to get his gun, because he was going to shoot me in the legs. So they're bringing in mock shootings and paramilitary punishments into the context of the relationship. And then surveillance, that idea in coercive control that you're always being watched. He always knows where you are and what you're doing. And what a number of the interviews showed me was that women are having that, the usual surveillance that happens in a coercive control context where he's watching your phone, he's isolating you from your family, he's using your children as blackmail. But then one in particular is instructive, and this was for a number of women, but one guy who was a high up in one of the groups had introduced her, his partner, to a number of men under his command who were instructed to watch her every single place she went. She was given layers of people who had different jobs in watching her in different places and spaces. And these were the ones who had exact punishment on her should she step out of the confines of what he wanted. So that's a very quick snapshot of the model and the depth of this here. I will say I was quite taken aback with the findings of what I came across here. And in that it explains, I hope, and I think a first step forward to us trying to understand what the relationship is between paramilitarism at a community level and the daily experience of women in their lives. And I think for me, the is this dualistic role that paramilitaries are playing, that their very presence at community level and the way they have set themselves up historically, which many scholars in Northern Ireland have pointed us towards, offers this implicit, tacit, the bowl that we all swim in. And then they can use that as a basis within the relationship to exert control. So this relationship between implicit and explicit paramilitary control, I think, is really important and something that I need to do a lot more work on to try and figure out some more. Out of this work, I will say that I have developed a 5-year ERC funded project where I'm going to kind of go into this much further because I feel like this was a preliminary study, even though so much came out of it. So I'm attempting to make the gendered phenomenon of coercive control, to date absent from literatures on conflict violence, more discoverable in context of conflict, as well as conceptually relevant to how we understand women's experiences of conflict. It is a comparative project in comparing Northern Ireland and Colombia and one other case study which I'm identifying. And we're using phenomenology. I want to push past descriptions of violence to understanding the experience women have in their own words. And I have assembled a team on that. So there'll be more on that forthcoming in future, I think. And I leave it there. Thank you very much. Sorry for the hop, skip and a jump.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was interesting, fascinating. Thank you so much. We have one last speaker, and this is the speaker that is going to give her presentation in Spanish, Alejandra Alemán. Attorney. She's joining us from Women's Links Worldwide. She is a lawyer from the National University in Colombia who specializes in justice and peace building. So remember, if you need to adjust your the language, just go to the interpretation icon that's in the shape of a little globe, and you can choose the channel, English or Spanish, and there would be simultaneous translation to do this. So Alejandra, si quieres comenzar.
Buenos días y buenas tardes a todos y todas. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. Could you confirm if you can hear the English, please, for the speaker? If you give me a sign that's a yes on the chat, yes.
Sí, te escuchamos bien.
Perfecto. Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here with you and to share with you the case of Helena, which is a litigation that was strategic or a case in terms of reproductive violence. And we have worked through this with the organization that I am a part of. Let me start with this quote by Helena herself. And these are observations in 2025 before the JAP. I have endured many things, but the abortion was what finally destroyed me. I want this to be recognized, to be accepted and admitted, and so that we prevent this in the future. So she was talking about she wanted recognition, she wanted the truth. She didn't want punishment, she didn't want to be vengeful in return of what happened to her. So my 3 purposes or objectives today are the following. Let us reconstruct the case, what happened to Helena from the legal viewpoint, and then analyze the incident from the Constitutional Court's point of view on the JAP, and what are the lessons to be drawn from a strategic litigation or a strategic case in terms of feminism. For decades, women's bodies were called family planification, if you will, but it was a policy for mandatory reproductive control, to control women. and the actual judgment from JAP was SRVR 005. And the previous panel spoke to us about that the recruited women were forced to use forced contraception and forced abortions. So when we're thinking about accredited victims, we saw that 24% of girls who had been recruited were subjected to this forced contraception, and 90% of them were forced to abort without their consent. So this means there were interventions without medical care, without paying killers, being threatened, and violence exerted against the girls and the women who actually didn't want to go through with these interventions. So from Women's Link Worldwide, this is reproductive violence, as has been said, and this is a form of gender-based violence. That means that through coercive actions or forcing people to do things, it actually takes away your reproductive agency and autonomy and your freedom to decide. So this is a standalone concept within sexual violence. And let us remain that there are different aspects here, and these kind of actions have different effects. The reproductive violence includes bodily control because you are denied the option of having children, and also having the imposition of contraceptive elements or forced contraceptives on you. So we have to name it, we have to give it make it visible. It allows us to recognize it. It allows us to make reparations. And this is what we needed to do in Colombia. And these women were denied justice. And if I concentrate now on Helena's case, she was forcibly recruited when she was 14 years of age, and she was informed that there were injectable contraceptives that were mandatory. Years later, she became pregnant, she fell pregnant, and she wanted to be a mother. And when she was quite advanced, she was forced to abort. And this forced abortion was very, very traumatic because she resisted, and then she was threatened they were going to shoot her. And then finally, and without her consent, she was given medicine and she was operated on. The aftermath you can see in her, both physical and psychological. And she requested from the state, as a victim, she requested reparation and visibility, but she was denied to be entered into the RUV, which is the registration for victims. And she was even accused of forming part of an armed group. And such as Daniela was saying at the beginning, is one of the greatest challenges is that in Colombia, if you were part of an armed group, and this is explicit in the law, could not be considered to begin with a victim. In 2018, we started a process of protection, and this is what we presented to the court with Helena, and an exception was applied to the inconstitutionality of having her excluded, and this is thanks to the Act 1448. So this is why we have a landmark judgment that recognized Elena as a victim of the conflict through forced recruitment, and she was a victim of displacement, forced displacement, and sexual violence. And we were talking here about these forced abortions and these forced contraceptive, because the law for the victims doesn't actually only recognizes the category of sexual violence. So this is the legal figure we used. So the Constitutional Court, following the relevant parts of the law, recognized her case, and they ordered her to be included in the RUV, and also ordered that she should have care, health care, and they actually recognized the crimes, this violence behind the lines, were to be considered as war crimes. This is very important. For the first time, a state institution believed Helena, believed the victim, and this generated a change of precedent. And this actually broke paradigms that the ex-combatants had to cannot be considered victims. And this actually forced us to rethink what we have in a legal system defined as victims, thinking of the human perspective, and something we needed to introduce in the face of a peace process. We had other processes open before the JEP and the Commission of Truth, or a public inquiry, if you will. In 2024, the JEP, through the judgments corresponding to case 007, recognize the protective violence as a standalone category, and then you open the doors to be able to investigate the forced contraception and the forced abortions under this judgment. And Helena was represented as a victim in this macro trial. This is a milestone because it gave visibility. If you force a woman to be a mother, or if you force a woman to interrupt her pregnancy, then is an act of strong violence. And this actually happens systematically within the setting of the FARC. And this was a systematic practice and generalized in the armed conflict in Colombia. And it was very, very important to introduce this to the Victims Act. And different organizations, that were relevant organizations, started recognizing this violence. There was some outstanding truth and started formulating recommendations so we would recognize this as sexual violence as well. Out of these processes, we have 5 lessons learned. First, we need to listen before we make representations. We need to allow the victims to tell their stories, to trust them. We should not speak for themselves, and we should give their voices priority. We must name things. We must give visibility to things if we want to change things. If you don't give it a name, it's not recognized, and then that has no reparation. That was number 2. Thirdly, we're talking about the fact that we need some legal creativity. Let us remember the judgment that set a precedent, saying that some of the provisions of the law were not constitutional, and we were very careful because we didn't want the victims to feel re-victimized and relive that victimization. And this justice is not always the same for all of them. In the 4th place, we have the truth is the reparation. It's not about damages or compensation. This is what happened. You have believed me. You have been a victim. And there's a recognition, and that in itself is a way of repairing the harm. And then in the 5th, we have the ethics to do with going hand in hand with the person, looking after their health, even after the judgment. And this is perhaps one of the greatest things we learn, one of the greatest challenges at the same time, from the ethical point of view. Lastly, I wanted to leave you with a sentence, with a quote: "No woman deserves this." And this is how she closed the oral evidence before the court. And the justice isn't just to fine, to punish. You need credibility, you need to tell the truth, and that in itself is reparation. And whatever happened to women's bodies was very, very powerful. So it's not a judgment with a punishment, it's an act of credibility. We are naming what happened. It's not naming and shaming in order to be vengeful, it's naming and shaming in order to recognize and to begin the reparation process. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Alejandra. Thank you very much. So we have just like 5 minutes or maybe less, so space for like 1 or 2 questions, so we can have a little break and then move to the next panel of this afternoon. So does anybody have a question from the ones that are joining us online that you want to ask the speakers? Questions? Open. Okay, Daniela has a question here.
Hello, Cristina, Alejandra, and Ashley. Thank you for attending today. I'm quite happy to have you, all three of you, into this panel or in this conference. I think like the three of you have brought like a lot of like very important insights about like strategic litigation, the work that Women's Link Worldwide and Center of Reproductive Rights have done in relation to bringing other like non-sexual harms into the spotlight in Colombia, and also like the work of Ashley in relation to coercive control. I think it's going to be quite relevant here in Northern Ireland, and I also think it could be like a quite interesting approach in Colombia to start considering also this issue. But just to make like a very specific or like general question for the three of you is, I think I mentioned in my initial presentation that there has been quite of a challenge for some of the victims to kind of like recognize gender-based harms that are non-sexual as punishable or as like acts that are criminalized. So in relation to your experience, in relation to your work with victims, how do you think will be kind of like the best way or a better way for these individuals, these victims, to recognize those harms that are non-sexual as acts that are punishable in some way or that are wrongful acts, without kind of like taking their voice or like imposing them like a point of view, as I think it was one of the points of that Alejandra was trying to make, but like no taking away their voice, the voice of the victim, and imposing kind of like a point of view. So I don't know if that question makes a bit of sense for the three of you, but yeah. I don't know which the three of you would like to start first to answer the question.
I can start since I was the first one. Thank you, Daniela, for your question. And I think it's really important because actually that was some of the challenges that people working within the HEP have pointed to us. Actually, in the work that we are doing currently with organizations in Nariño, Cauca, and Santander, we've realized that, of course, the lack of knowledge, and particularly in the case of reproductive rights, create a huge challenge for people to recognize reproductive violence. And for us, one of the answers have been to approach organizations that already have a really trust work with leaders and with women in the field. And these spaces where they already have this trust, and when they already have a previous work, not like an international organization coming through the field trying to get the testimonies like right away. That's not how it works. But for us, it's more a case of bringing information that could be useful for them to recognize it, to talk about it in a really safe space with people they trust. And that's been the way in which we are actually recognize many cases. And we have been able to actually brought information if they want to come forward to the HEP, for example. So I think it's more a thing on connecting the trust that it's already built with organizations, but bringing useful information for them to share with the women. And for us, that has been like a really interesting opportunity for also acknowledge forms of reproductive violence that we didn't realize existed, and that they are still happening after the trust, after the peace accord. So basically, for us, it's been a really learning process and a work along with our organizations, not bringing this position from a vertical perspective, but more an horizontal construction, being really mindful on what is helpful both for the leaders and for the organizations in the field, for them to tell us if this results in something that is useful for them, and also what perspectives this work could open for them. So yes, this is actually the work that we are currently doing, and it's a challenge, but we believe that it is really important to bring these conversations and to open those spaces for us to understand better how this continuing happening in Colombia, actually.
I can come in if you like. Thank you. Thanks for the question. It's a great question. And I love the premise of it about the voices of women, because I think, as much as there was a debate earlier around this, whether some of these harms are silenced or not, For me, it's more about recognition. Has there been adequate recognition, whether legally or otherwise in society, of the range of harms that have been related to the Troubles? And I think that's a pending question. And to answer this, I harken back to, the work of, violence against women during the Troubles and what Teresa started our conversation on, and then the contemporary piece, which I've raised here. And I think there's two aspects on this. How will recognition be given to the Troubles related context to some of these harms? And at the moment, you can go down two different routes. One is the debate on the emerging or the pending space for transitional justice, whatever that might look like eventually in Northern Ireland. And Teresa pointed us toward thinking about that. And I really think about, if there is a process in place, what framework will be used? What will be imposed on victims in terms of what they can and can't talk about? And what kind of space will be made and for women themselves to articulate what the harm is, the quality, the nature, the texture, the context of that harm, and without reinforcing hierarchies, without subscribing to what legal frameworks tell us the harm has to subscribe to. I think that's really important. And then on the other end of the range with my work, I've been looking at coercive control legislation globally and in Northern Ireland, and there is provision there for the role of third parties in coercive control. Will there be space in domestic courts to understand not just a third party, but the nature of paramilitarism as the context to coercive control in the kinds of situations I've described? And I'm emerging into work that's looking at how would women's voices articulate for us what it's like to get caught between domestic legislation that doesn't work and a transitional justice process that possibly might not either. And so will there be space for women's voices to tell us what it is they want to talk about in either of those spaces? So I think there's a lot of work still to be done on that. Thank you.
También me gustaría como responder ahí rápidamente, añadir
Reply
algo a
quickly.
esa pregunta.
Let me add
Y es
something.
que creo que, perdón si se escucha un pitido,
You
estamos
can hear
en
me,
una
of
evacuación
course.
acá en Bogotá, pero espero que se escuche.
Yes, I do apologize if you hear background
Yo creo
noise,
que
says
hay
the
un gran
speaker.
reto
I
respecto del
think
reconocimiento. Creo que
the
la gente lo ha
challenge
abordado de
is
forma adecuada.
huge,
Al
but
ser
I
el primer
think
organismo
we
que reconoce
are
esto abiertamente, ha
definitely the
reconocido incluso como una política de la
JEP is
política
doing
de
it
las
quite
FARC,
right,
la violencia reproductiva, y
recognizing
es un gran
reproductive
avance en
violence.
materia
And
para
this is a
la
huge
reparación de
step
las
forward
víctimas y
for
para el
us
reconocimiento
for
general.
reparation of the
Pero
victims
creo que ahí
and
hay un
general
gran matiz
acknowledgement.
de la justicia
However,
transicional y de los
of
retos que
course, there are
experimentamos, y creo que ese
nuances
es
when
uno
we're
de los
thinking
mayores
about the
desafíos que tenemos.
challenges,
Y es
transitional
que la
justice.
jurisdicción
What
especial
we
para la
have,
paz
what's our
también se basa
domestic
sobre el
legal system and
reconocimiento de los
legislation is
comparecientes
not enough.
y es de las
Is it
personas que
enough?
ejercieron estas
And then, of
agresiones.
course, we
Y
need
en
to
este
think
momento
about
estamos
the
experimentando un gran reto
confrontation
para que
between
las
the
personas de las FARC y
perpetrators
el
and the
secretariado de las
victims.
FARC
At the
asuman
moment,
su
we want the
responsabilidad y asuman que la
secretariat
violencia
of
reproductiva ocurrió.
the
Entonces, si bien
FARCEP to
institucionalmente se
say,
está dando el
yes,
espacio
this
para dar este
happened, this
reconocimiento,
was
se le está dando la
reproductive
voz a las
violence.
víctimas y también se está nombrando la
So it's
categoría
not
de
just
violencia
about
reproductiva,
recognizing
aún enfrentamos
the
un gran
victims
reto
and
para que las
reproductive
personas
violence. We still have
pertenecientes a
a
los grupos
challenge.
armados que
So
dieron
the
estas
people who
decisiones y
were part of
promovieron
those
esta
armed groups
política
and who actually
de
promoted
violencia
such
reproductiva
policies
tengan este
actually
reconocimiento.
start
Y es lo que está
recognizing
pasando en este
what it
momento. Las
was.
víctimas esperan
And
que
this
ese
is where we are.
reconocimiento se pasó
Victims are
y
waiting
lo que
for
está
that
pasando es que los
acknowledgement
comparecientes no están haciendo este
from
reconocimiento
the perpetrators. And at the moment,
porque
this is not
efectivamente
happening.
sucedieron en la
This is
Comisión.
still lacking
Entonces, este es uno de los
for
mayores
us.
retos que también
And
estamos
this, I would say,
enfrentando
is one of the
como
greatest
sociedad
challenges that
civil
we
en
have
Chile.
in front of us at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for those very thorough answers. Thank you to Christina, to Dr. Ashling Swain, and to Alejandra for joining us from some of you from very far away. Thank you for, and also thank you for everybody who's still here with us. We're gonna have like 5 minutes less.
I think it's better just like if you want to continue with the last panel with your.
Should we just?
Oh yes, like
Okay.
just like maybe like 5 minutes of
Okay,
break.
so we'll have like our last 5 minute break before jumping straight into the final panel, complex childhoods, gender-based violence, forced recruitment, and criminal exploitation. We would have two speakers here, Dr. Colm Walsh from our own Queen's University Belfast, and Juan Manuel Martinez Ramirez, who is head of the Victims Legal Representation Team, Coalico. So just like 3, 4, 5 minutes before we jump straight to the last panel of today. Thank you so much.
Okay, hello everyone again. So we're going to start with the last panel. So as Diana mentioned before, this panel is about complex childhoods and the issue of gender-based violence and forced recruitment and criminal exploitation, both in Colombia and Northern Ireland. So we have like two experts in this panel. One is, we're going to start with Dr. Colm Walsh from Queen's University Belfast. I will try to give you like a very general bio of you. So you're a senior lecturer in the School of Social Science, Education and Social Work here at the School of Law. You're also a member of the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And you have like extent experience in relation to youth violence, criminal exploitation, community violence prevention, and trauma-informed justice. So I will just give you like the mic for you to make your presentation today, Colm. I will just like share here your slides.
That's okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. And hopefully everybody can see this. Thank you very much. And thanks very much to Daniela for organizing this. I'm blown away by the range of contributions. And also how much some of this kind of disparate research connects to some of the findings of my own research. I was really struck by Teresa's comment earlier around this idea of speed and time, and somehow the range of issues that we're talking about are historical, and they go back decades, if not generations. And in another sense, the issues that we're talking about today are very contemporary. And I guess one of my big reflections is that these issues and challenges that are kind of the big wicked problems, and they're very persistent. We're really only trying to get a sense of what they actually are, how they affect people, and as a society, how do we best respond? So my background, as Daniela said, is around working with young people primarily as a practitioner and engaging with some young people who were very vulnerable to criminal exploitation, although we didn't call it that. That's a very new term, and who were caught up in conflict-related violence. And then I moved into research to try to deal with emerging gaps in our knowledge and understanding, first of all, of children's experiences of those issues, but also how do we best respond and build an evidence base around responses to prevention. So whenever I was reflecting and again connecting to Teresa's idea of time, I was struck by this this kind of analogy of a railway track with multiple stops. First of all, I guess the most obvious reason is that over the last number of years there has been a journey with multiple stops on it, and at some points in those journeys we have had quite a lot of people move with us. At other points in the journey, we've had tourists who are just there to kind of see what's going on. At other points in time, we may have very small groups of very interested people, but real champions of what's happening. And at other times, we've had absolutely nobody listen to what's happening. But it's that combination of the research taking place and the variety of people we've kind of went on a journey with that has contributed, at least to my understanding, of what's going on with children and where we still need to go. So I'm going to take you very briefly, as Aisling said as well, they're trying to get so much into 10 minutes or so is difficult, but it'll give you a sense of the research that I've been involved in really over the last 5 years, the research that I'll speak to this afternoon. So the first stop is actually Cheryl had mentioned earlier in the session around it would be very useful to quantify some of our experiences. And she also mentioned, as others have, this idea of trauma. It's very hard to disentangle the experiences that we've been hearing about so far without understanding this idea of trauma. But until recently, in the Northern Ireland context, it was very difficult to quantify the extent of trauma and the nature of trauma and the ways in which those experiences and impact were gendered. It's not new news that childhoods in Northern Ireland were dominated by conflict, by violence, as well as a whole range of positive experiences. But I guess the most commonly understood is this normalization of state and non-state violence and the impact that had intuitively. I was lucky enough to be commissioned to lead the first ever prevalence study on adversity which connects to the global movement, I guess, around understanding experiences during childhood have an impact on adulthood, and it transitions not just for the individual, but across generations. The difference for our study is that we wanted to extend the quantification of experiences in the family home to also include what goes on for children in the community, and to augment that with conflict-related experiences. And what we found was interesting. We were able to quantify for the first time the extent of exposure to violence, and it opened up questions, I guess, and identified gaps in how we understand children's exposure to a whole range of violence. Again, Aisling had, I think, implied that there is a connection and a correlation between experiences that children have in the home and also in the community. And again, that tallies with some of this prevalence data. Now, there's a few interesting things that I just want to point out. I guess that there's a divergence in experience across age groups. So older participants in this study were much more likely to experience conflict-related violence, and we see younger people are much more likely to report experiencing community-based violence. But there was something really interesting that went on within that. And it was this, where we expect post-conflict, post-1998, younger age groups to actually report very little exposure to state or non-state violence. That was not actually what came across in the data. As PI, I was very surprised that we were seeing younger people who grew up post-conflict, post-98, still reporting that they had significant exposure to paramilitary-related violence in the form of threats, intimidation. And I guess that makes sense. We see that in the media. We've seen it very recently. This is taken from 2021. The riots that were in the aftermath of the public health restrictions. We had quite widespread civil unrest in Northern Ireland. And that opened up a question around, okay, if children have experienced violence in a range of forms and across time, and it was in the context of conflict, and we're arguably post-conflict, why are we still seeing these kinds of activities? And the language began to change, and there was a focus on children post-98. That they created a bit of pressure, I think, politically to try to understand what was going on for children, but opened up an opportunity to understand this whole idea of criminal exploitation and put the experiences of children much more within a safeguarding lens rather than a criminal justice lens. So this was another study then that I led on, which was trying to understand from the perspective of children how they understood criminal exploitation. Have they ever heard of it? How did they experience it? How did they understand it? How do they think in the context of their lives and their communities that that sort of exploitation could be prevented? And what was interesting was that exploitation seemed to happen across a whole range of different ways. There were young people who were very acutely caught up in serious crime, harm, violence, and were creating new harm for other victims. And there were other young people at the base of this pyramid who may not have realized that they were actually being manipulated and engaged in criminality. There were a few very interesting observations from the interview data. One was that there was no consensus around what criminal exploitation was. The second was the range of activities that were involved. And again, as Aisling said, it extended beyond physical violence, but also that it was gendered. And it was gendered in the range of activities that children were caught up in, but it was also gendered in the perceptions of those victims. In fact, many of the children didn't see themselves as victims. They actually believed that they were they had considerable agency in the interactions that they had. And particularly with girls, the reflection of males on the behavior of females is that it was wrapped up in a sense that they know exactly what they're doing, they get something out of it, and the idea that they were being exploited and they were victims of some sort of criminal exploitation just didn't enter the conversation at all. there was a kind of a quid pro quo. People get something out of it, and if they do, then there's no exploitation. So if children experience these kinds of exposures, and we know from the larger prevalence study that it has a considerable impact, another study sought to engage with young men, but adults who were in the criminal justice system, and get a sense of the longitudinal impact of some of those experiences and being exploited and coerced by paramilitary groups. We interviewed adult men who were on probation, and it was stark, some of the accounts of their early experiences that actually tie very closely to some of the experiences from Bogota. That many of their first experiences were around the age of 14. There was significant violence, there was significant threat, and that they tried to cope with these experiences often through substances. And while there were very clear indicators of significant mental health issues, including trauma and PTSD, very few of them were ever properly assessed, diagnosed, and none of them were ever treated for these conditions. So what is the end result? We have a population who have been widely exposed. We have children whose lives are somehow dominated by experiences of violence, and without properly understanding those and responding to those, we have adults then who are in the criminal justice system because they are trying to cope largely with trauma-related issues. We recently, just last week or the week before, have published this report. And apologies if you can't see the QR codes there. Which is looking at, okay, what should the state now be doing? What is the system response? This is not a job only for police, for courts, for criminal justice systems, but it should necessarily involve safeguarding, it should involve education. What's going on? So we are able now to more accurately say where we think criminal exploitation is taking place, but surveys with the systems in those areas show that they are largely unready to respond. And we looked at how ready they were across a range of areas. So for instance, how ready are they to store data related to criminal exploitation? How capable are they of sharing information between systems? How ready do they feel equipped to understand and respond to the issues? Do they feel they're adequately trained and supervised? And I guess across those range of different areas, the message is that most of our state systems are not adequately ready. They're stronger in some areas, but overall there's a whole range of different ways that they could be better equipped, but to understand the phenomena and to respond to the phenomena. And there's ways that they can do it. So where we're currently at is we're supporting those systems to develop a screening tool. We now know enough to say what the red flags are, what the indicators of probable exploitation are, and that as part of a wider response, the screening tool could be helpful in at least facilitating a conversation between agencies. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colin. Okay, I think I'll stop here sharing. And yeah, thank you, Colin. Excellent presentation. Really, really interesting. And I think it will complement a lot of probably what Juan Manuel is gonna try to talk about, the experience of like the complex childhood of children who were forcibly recruited in Colombia. So now it's the turn of Juan Manuel to speak. Just to give you a very general kind of like bio or like reference in relation to Juan Manuel. So he's currently the lead attorney of the victims legal representation team before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace with Coalición contra la Vinculación de Niños, Niñas y Jóvenes en el Conflicto Armado en Colombia, also called Coalico. Juan Manuel, he's a lawyer from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia. He also has earned a master's degree in law with an emphasis in human rights and from the same university, and a specialization in criminal law. He also holds a specialization in conflict resolution from Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, and he also holds a master's degree on childhood from Universidad Santo Tomás. So I will just keep it that briefly, and Juan Manuel, you can start. Juan Manuel va a hablar en español. He's also going to speak in Spanish for people who don't know. So Juan Manuel, muchas gracias por estar acá. Tienes ya el micrófono,
Sí, en
puedes hablar.
español. Gracias. ¿Ya puedo iniciar?
Sí.
Am I able to start?
Sí.
Perfecto, voy a iniciar. Muchísimas
That's
gracias
great.
por la
Thank you very
invitación
much
que nos han
for the
compartido
invitation
para compartir nuestro punto de
to
vista
share
en
our
este
perspective
diálogo,
in this dialogue.
todas las exposiciones que han hecho hasta este momento
All
han
the
sido realmente
presentations so far
muy interesantes
have been
y
really
nosotros vamos a
interesting,
concentrarnos
and we are going to
precisamente
focus
en
specifically
cómo los niños, las
on
niñas,
how
las
children
infancias en Colombia que están
in
atravesadas
Colombia
por el
who
reclutamiento,
have been affected
ilícito,
by
hacen
illegal
que estos niños y
recruitment
estas niñas se entiendan como unos
make
sujetos
these
complejos,
children
complejos
be
en varias
seen
categorías.
as complex
En
subjects
primer
in
lugar,
different categories.
quisiera
Firstly,
indicarles muy brevemente desde
I'd
dónde
like
estamos
to
dando
very briefly
estas experiencias y estas
comment
opiniones, y en
where
ese
these
sentido,
experiences are coming
pues, es
from.
importante
And in that
comentarles
sense,
que
it's essential
yo
to
trabajo
let you
para
know
una
that I
plataforma
work
de
for a
organizaciones de la
platform
sociedad civil
made up
que se
with
creó en
civil
1999 y
society
que
organizations
busca
created in
disminuir los impactos del
1999,
conflicto
which
armado
seeks to
en
reduce
las
the
niñas y
impact
en
of
la
armed
adolescencia
conflict
colombiana.
in
Esta
children and adolescents
está
in Colombia.
compuesta por una serie de
This platform
organizaciones,
is
algunas
composed of
nacionales,
different
algunas
organizations. Some
internacionales, y
are
se llama
national
Coalico. Es
and
la
some are
Coalición contra
international,
la
and it
Vinculación
is
de
called
niños, niñas y
COALICO,
jóvenes al conflicto
which is the
armado colombiano.
coalition
Desde aquí es
for
desde donde
children and
vamos
adolescents
a
against the
presentar
armed conflict in Colombia.
estas
We are going
ideas
to,
el día de hoy.
this is the platform from where we're going to
Lo
present these
primero que
ideas to
nosotros
you today.
quisiéramos exponer
The first thing
es
we'd like to
una
say
premisa a partir de la
is
cual
the
se va a
premise
desarrollar
based on which
esta
we're going to develop
digamos, esta ponencia. Y
this
es que los
presentation.
conflictos armados
Armed
tienen
conflicts
unos efectos o unas
have
consecuencias
a
que son
disproportionate
desproporcionadas en cuanto a
impact or
los niños, las
consequences
niñas y los
on children
adolescentes.
and
Y
adolescents.
estas consecuencias
These
desproporcionadas,
disproportionate impact,
proporcionalmente son desproporcionadas respecto de los adultos,
they are
en razón
disproportionate in
o
comparison
debido
to
a
adults
las
because of
características de las
the
etapas o de la etapa
characteristics of
de la
the
etapa vital que viven esos niños,
stage
esas
of
niñas y
life
estos
that these
adolescentes.
children and adolescents
En
are
ese
in.
sentido y
In that
el
sense,
marco del conflicto armado
and
colombiano,
within the
donde los
framework
niños, las
of the
niñas
armed
y los
conflict in
adolescentes pueden
Colombia,
ser víctimas de
children and
distintos
adolescents can be victims
crímenes y
of
distintas
different
conductas que afectan
offenses
sus
and
derechos, ¿no?
behaviors which affect
Por
their
ejemplo,
rights.
nosotros
For example,
monitoreamos la violencia
we monitor
sexual, los
sexual
actos,
violence
los crímenes que atentan
and
contra la integridad
offenses
física de
against
los
the
niños y de las
physical
niñas, los
integrity of
homicidios,
children,
también el desplazamiento,
murders,
también
and also
las
displacements,
retenciones ilegales,
as well as
la toma de
illegal
hospitales y escuelas.
retentions.
Dentro de ese gran
And
cúmulo de
within
violencias o de
that
crímenes
high
de los
number
cuales pueden ser
of
víctimas los niños y las niñas en un
offenses
contexto de
that
conflicto
children
armado,
can be victims of
específicamente para el caso
within
del
a context of
reclutamiento
armed
ilícito,
conflict, and
la
specifically
experiencia
with
del
regards
niño
to the
dentro del grupo
forced
armado
or illegal
significa para
recruitment.
nosotros
The experience of
una
children is for
continua y
us
concurrente vulneración de todos sus
is
derechos.
a continuous
Y
vulneration of
especialmente
their
vamos
rights.
a
We
centrarnos
are specifically going to
el niño
focus
y la niña
in
reclutados, ¿no? Y
children
esta va a
who
ser
are
la tesis
recruited, and this is going
de
to
esta
be
exposición. Y es
the
que el
basis
niño y
of
la
this
niña víctimas de
presentation. The
reclutamiento,
children who are
niño, niña
victims of
soldado, niño, niña reclutado,
recruitments,
son sujetos
children
complejos y son
soldiers,
sujetos
are
complejos en
complex
diferentes
subjects
dimensiones.
in different
Unas dimensiones más
dimensions.
jurídicas, unas dimensiones
Some are legal
más
points of
psicosociales,
view, and
y
others are
aquí
more
podemos ver
psychosocial.
por lo menos tres
But
ejemplos
here
de
we
cómo
can see at least
los
3
niños y las niñas
examples of
reclutados son
how
sujetos complejos.
recruited children are
En primer
complex
lugar,
beings.
por ejemplo, donde
First of
nosotros
all,
podemos ver
what we can see is
que el niño y la niña
that
reclutados son
recruited
sujetos
children
complejos y que
are
precisamente
complex
lo
subjects.
mencionaba el expositor
And as the previous presenter said,
expositor que me precedió, hay una importante negación de la
there is
condición
a
de víctimas de
denial
los niños
of
y las
their
niñas reclutados, ¿no?
status as
No
victims, of their
solamente a
victimhood.
nivel cultural
not just on a cultural level, different social agents have denied or have naturalized the recruitment behavior. And in Colombia, specifically, the state in its different bodies has denied victims or have denied children who have recruited their status as victims. This, what it does is they push the responsibility for recruited children from the recruiters to the recruited. They say the child was not a victim of recruitment, but rather that child chose to join this armed agent. This denial as victims means that in many cases, some of the children who were victims cannot be understood today as victims, as people who suffered violence or some forms of violence, but instead it is understood that that crime did not take place. There is an interesting debate here, and currently those who are the perpetrators, those who are responsible for these crimes, appeal to the political agency of the child as a way to justify the offense being committed. Another one of the examples where we can see that they're complex being is in the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim or, recruited. The child who is recruited develops a relationship with that perpetrator that in many cases it means that they see that recruiter as a father or a mother or some kind of protective figure, because there are many situations of violence before the commitment of any of these crimes. For example, violence within the family, or where there are some living conditions which are very precarious. So the relationship established between the perpetrator and the victim, or the recruiter and the recruited, it makes the way to understand the crime makes it much more complex. When we talk about the premise of this presentation, the effects of this recruitment are disproportionate on children because this stage of their life is part of the time when the subjectivity is being developed, when they are being developed, when they're developing as a person. And in that sense, the commission of this crime affects this creation of subjectivity. And a third example in which recruited children are complex subjects can be seen when the child who has been a victim of recruitment can be seen as responsible of committing other offenses, especially serious ones. When this child who was recruited committed murder or sexual violence against the civil population, when he or she was still a child. But this debate can also be extended that those responsible of the armed conflict justify their behavior by saying that they were recruited themselves by other perpetrators when they were minors.
La complejidad del sujeto, del niño y de la
The
niña,
complexity of that
es tal, tanto a
subject, of
nivel
the child,
psicosocial
is
como a
such,
nivel jurídico,
both
que se
from the
pueden
legal
entender
and
unas
from the social
discusiones,
cultural point of
por lo
view,
menos en el plano de lo normativo aquí en
in
Colombia,
in
que
in the
ejemplifican muy bien este tipo
framework,
de
we can
situaciones.
see
Aquí voy a
examples of these
presentar
situations. Here I'm
básicamente
going
dos
to
ejemplos de cómo
present two examples
jurídicamente y
of how,
normativamente en
from the
Colombia
legal point
se
of view,
crean
in
categorías
Colombia,
duales
dual categories are
que
established,
no deberían existir de
which
forma
should
paralela,
not really
pero que en
exist in
Colombia
parallel,
coexisten
but
en el
they
sujeto del niño
coexist
reclutado.
in
El
Colombia.
primero de los casos
The
es
first
precisamente
case
la
is
tensión que
that
existe
of
entre
that
el niño
tension that
reclutado,
exists
entendido
between
como
the
sujeto de
recruited
especial
child
protección constitucional,
as a
y el
subject of
niño
a special
reclutado
constitutional
entendido al mismo
protection
tiempo
and
como
the
un
recruited
combatiente o
child
una
as a
persona
combatant
que toma
or
parte activa
a
en las
person
hostilidades, ¿no?
who
De hecho,
actively
en la Constitución
participates in
Política Colombiana
hostilities.
hay unos
In
sujetos que
this
tienen una serie
debate,
de garantías
there are subjects who
en sus
have
derechos,
certain
garantías constitucionales de protección
constitutional
que son
guarantees
reforzadas,
for
¿no?
protection, which are
Los niños y
reinforced.
las niñas, las personas menores de
Children,
18 años,
those who are
son sujetos de
minors,
especial protección,
are subjects of special
sujetos de
protection
especial protección constitucional
from the
en
constitutional
Colombia.
point of view in
Y
Colombia.
precisamente los niños y las
And
niñas, de la mano de
children
las garantías que establece la
with
Convención de los
the
Derechos del Niño y el Protocolo
guarantees
Facultativo,
provided by
aplicable aquí
the
en Colombia,
Convention on the Rights of the
deberían
Child applied in
entenderse como
Colombia,
sujetos, por
should
ejemplo,
be understood
respecto de
as
los cuales sus derechos prevalecen, ¿no?
subjects
Sus
whose
derechos
rights
prevalecen respecto
prevail
de otras personas.
above
Sin embargo, hay
others.
una tensión fuerte
However,
y
there
este
is a
año,
strong
por ejemplo,
tension,
cuando
and
se
this
debatió en
year,
Corte Constitucional
when
si
it was
las
debated
víctimas de
in the
reclutamiento
Constitutional
podían
Court
ser,
whether victims of
digamos, y
recruitment
si los
could
miembros de
be,
actores armados ilegales
or
podían ser víctimas
members of
de
illegal
crímenes de guerra
armed groups
intrafilas,
could
porque esa
be
discusión se dio este año en la Corte Constitucional, se ve
could
muy
be
clara esa
victims
tensión, ¿no?
of
Cuando el niño
war
cuando la niña,
crimes when the
el niño y la niña
child
son reclutados,
is recruited.
no pierden esas
They do
garantías
not lose
constitucionales de
those
su derecho
constitutional
desde esa
guarantees
protección
as
constitucional,
subjects of special
pero al mismo
constitutional
tiempo,
protection,
pues son
but at the same
partícipes de
time,
las hostilidades. Y un
they
segundo
take
gran
part in the
ejemplo se ve,
hostilities.
por ejemplo,
The
se ve
second
en el caso
big
de
example is
la ley
that
de
of
víctimas, a la cual ya se hizo
the
referencia aquí
Victims
con el caso de
Act,
Elena. Y
which
es
was
que la
mentioned in
víctima de
Elena's case.
reclutamiento, aunque
The
es
victim of
entendida a
recruitment,
nivel penal
although
como una
Juan
víctima,
Manuel,
is
qué pena
understood.
interrumpirte.
a nivel
Solamente para avisarte
administrativo
que te quedan
plano de la
2 minutos más
reparación
o menos
como
de
víctima,
presentación,
si
Juan
no
pero
existe
Manuel,
vínculo de algún
I
continúa.
modo
apologize for
armado,
interrupting, but
siendo
you
una
only have a
persona
couple of
menor
minutes
de
left.
18 años. Entonces, estas categorías
These
duales, en términos
categories
jurídicos, no corresponden con esta
do not
complejidad del
correspond
sujeto del niño
to the
reclutado. Muy
complexity of this
brevemente
recruited
expondría
child. And very,
unos
very
daños
briefly, I wanted
causados a
to
estos
talk about the
niños y
damage
niñas
or the
reclutados
harms caused
y que
to
hemos
these recruited
evidenciado
children
precisamente en la
that we
Constitución
have been
Especial para la
able
Paz, en la JEP.
to see in the Special
Que
Jurisdiction for
responden a
Peace,
esa
the
complejidad del niño
JEP,
y de la niña
which
como sujetos que
answers
son
this
víctimas de un crimen,
complexity
pero que
of the
este
child who
crimen
are
los lleva a
victims of a
participar activamente en
crime,
las
but
hostilidades, ¿no?
this
Un
also
primer grupo de
leads them
daños
to
que
participating
habría que
actively
tener
in
en
the
cuenta son
hostility.
esos
One
daños a la
first group of
identidad
harms are
de las
those
víctimas que
of
nosotros
the harms to
acompañamos,
their
víctimas de
identity.
reclutamiento que acompañamos,
The victims that we
manifiestan un
accompany
duelo,
say that they have
un dolor por
the
la
grief,
pérdida
the pain
de
of
esa
losing
infancia que
their
vivieron
childhood
otros niños y
that
otras niñas
other
que
children
no fueron
experience
reclutados, ¿no? Porque ese periodo de vida no
because
se
they
va
were
a
not
volver a
recruited.
recuperar
And that's because
y
that
ellos
part of your
extrañan
life
ese
is
momento
not going to be
de
recovered.
vida y haberlo
So
vivido en
they
condiciones pues mucho más
they feel the
favorables
grief
y
of not
propicias para
having
su
been
desarrollo
able to
integral,
live that
¿no?
period of their
En
life in
segundo
more
lugar,
favorable
unos
conditions.
daños a la
Secondly,
integridad
there is
física y
the harm
psicológica que
to the
en
physical
el
and
caso
psychological
son
integrity
pues
that in many
marcas de guerra
cases
visibles, ¿no?
leave
Amputaciones, pérdidas
scars,
de
war
miembros
scars,
superiores o
like
inferiores,
amputations
pérdida
of limbs, loss of sight, etc. But it can also include mental health issues
reproductivo
or
o
reproductive
también incluyen pues unos daños a la
damage.
integridad en términos psicológicos, ¿no? La
So both
posibilidad
mental
de
health and,
estrés, de trauma
for
que
example,
genera y que
stress,
no permite, por
trauma,
ejemplo, que estos niños
that
que ya hoy
doesn't
son
allow
adultos, después
those
de haber
children who are
pasado
now
varios años
adults after several years
de la salida, del momento de la salida del grupo
after
armado,
leaving the
siguen
armed
teniendo
group
problemas, por ejemplo, para
are
dormir,
still
¿no?
experiencing
Hay un
problems,
tercer grupo que
to
es
sleep. There's
relevante
a third
mencionar
group which
y
is
es ese
relevant and
que
important to
comprende
mention,
todos los
which is
daños a la esfera
that
relacional del niño y de la niña.
including all the harms with
Cuando el niño y
regards
la
to their
niña fueron
relationships.
reclutados
When
de
the
manera
child
ilícita,
was
se
recruited
generó una
illegally,
ruptura de
there
vínculos
was a
comunitarios,
breakdown of
familiares y
the
sociales
relationships in the
difícilmente se
community
van
and
reconstruyendo.
social, from the social point of view, which
La
are difficult
pérdida de
to
esos
rebuild. The loss
vínculos,
of those links
aún de hecho de
and
aptitudes para la socialización,
even the
el
socialization
daño que se
skills,
causa es tan
because
profundo que
the
no
damage that is
permite, por
caused is so
ejemplo, que
grave,
niños y
that
niñas
doesn't
reclutadas
allow those children
tengan unas relaciones
to have
interpersonales iguales a las que
interpersonal
tenían
relationships
o
that
a las que
are
desarrollan niños
the
y niñas
same
que no han
or
atravesado estas circunstancias de
to those they
reclutamiento,
had or
hace que
to those who
nosotros
have not been
pongamos,
recruited.
digamos, un
That
énfasis
makes
en
us
esta esfera de los daños. Y
highlight
finalmente,
this
por supuesto,
type of
una
harm.
esfera de
And
daños
finally,
económicos
there is the
relacionados
economic
a la
harms,
afectación al proyecto de vida de ese
which
niño,
is
de esa niña.
that
En ese
in
sentido,
relation to the life
un ejemplo claro
project,
de cómo
a very
el
clear
niño y la
example
niña
of how
reclutados
the
son
child
sujetos
who has been
complejos
recruited is a
y
complex
la
being,
complejidad del
and
sujeto
also
se
the
puede observar en
complexity
los
can be
daños que se le
seen
causan,
in the
está, por
harms that have
ejemplo,
been
en
caused
la
to them.
estigmatización.
And for example, that can be
Un
seen
niño o
in
niña que fue reclutado y que se
stigmatization. A
entendió como
child that was
víctima,
recruited and was seen
hoy
as a
no
victim
puede en Colombia
can today
fácilmente indicar o expresar a
cannot
sus compañeros de
express
trabajo, a sus
easily
vecinos o a parte de su
to
familia que
their
fue
neighbors
reclutado,
or
porque
colleagues that they were
estas
recruited,
esferas sociales lo
because
van a
these
estigmatizar, ¿no? Lo
settings
van
are
a
going to
juzgar como
stigmatize
culpable del crimen que sufrió
him or her.
y
They're
lo van
going
a
to
rechazar. Se le
make
van
him
a cerrar, por ejemplo,
see him or
oportunidades
her as
laborales o
guilty,
de
and
otros tipos.
that person is going
En
to
ese
lose
sentido,
work
concluiríamos
opportunities.
esta
And
presentación y
this
quedo muy
is going to
atento a
be
las
the end
preguntas.
of my
Muchas gracias.
presentation, and I look forward to the questions.
Muchas gracias, Juan Manuel. Thank you very much, Juan Manuel. Excellent presentation. And I think I will just check if anyone has like any question here in the person. Yes, Monica, I think there is a mic.
Do we have to use the microphone or phone?
Yeah, I think because like they cannot hear. Well, let's see if you want to go forward.
Let's say if there's easiest for you.
Hello.
Do you want me to just go forward?
Yes, like better.
Well, my question was more for Dr. Walsh because I don't know a lot about the Colombian context, but I suppose in a similarity to the Colombian context. So I look at state sexual and gender violence and the troubles, but one of the things that struck me when you were talking about child exploitation is that in the narratives of them going to prison, a lot of them talk about how they were like 15. And there was a debate over whether they were going to Boschel or not at some point, and they really, really wanted to get sent to the adult prison because then they would have protection. Like they would get sent to the paramilitary basically section if they did it. But if you said to them, oh, you were made into a child soldier, they'd be shocked and horrified. They would be like, no, I didn't. That's not what happened. But it's so weird. So I suppose my question would be to Dr. Walsh, do you think we need to kind of come up with a different terminology when we look at combatant experiences, especially when they were young teens? Do you think we need to look at it more as criminal exploitation than anything else? And I suppose to Dr. Martinez, the question is, how do you deal with victims who don't identify as victims? They would, if you ask them, they'd be like, I'm an active participant, this happened, I signed up to this, and they were proud of it. So I suppose that would be my two questions.
Be easier if I come up. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point around terminology, and I guess the children and young people that are involved in my research are being exploited at a time when we have this transition taking place. We've got some confusion, at least at a very local level, around how we distinguish between the legacy of paramilitary organizations that still retain structures and, at least from the perspective of some people, retain some functions within community. And we have the emergence of organized criminal groups and confusion over what distinguishes between those groups, because there are still overlaps between organized criminal groups and paramilitary organizations. And in the context of these kinds of changes that haven't really been coherently articulated very well, that the role of children in the mix of that seems to fit better, and it seems to be much more relatable if we use the language of criminal exploitation. Now, they don't immediately understand that, and when we talk about criminal exploitation, they think of a phenomenon known as county lines, which we see much more widely in England, Wales, Scotland, which is essentially a business model focused on the movement of drugs out of big cities into more rural, out of city towns and smaller towns. So they understand that from Netflix and from movies, but don't see themselves as victims. But when we use the research process to, I guess, increase awareness of what this might look like in the Northern Irish context, I think it becomes very clear to us as researchers, and a little bit later to the participants in that research, that who they think of as friends, as partners, as neighbours, as people who they know in their community, and where they feel safe, are potentially exploiting them to engage in criminal activity. So I think the terminology is important. It's not well understood, but the research process can actually help increase awareness in that.
Juan Manuel, I don't know if you would like to also answer Monica's question.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
No sé si comprendí de forma completa
Let me
la
see if I
pregunta,
understood
pero
quite rightly.
particularmente para el contexto colombiano.
In terms of
Las
Colombian
víctimas
context
de
or as
reclutamiento que
settings,
no se
the
entienden
victims
como
of
víctimas
recruitment, they don't see themselves as victims.
que participaron en el conflicto y
So they
no se entienden
participated in
como
the
víctimas
conflict
del
and they don't
reclutamiento,
see themselves as victims, though,
aquí en Colombia,
or at least in
atienden
Colombia.
a la circunstancia de que son firmantes de paz, ¿no? Digamos, excombatientes. Ellos se identifican más como
They're
excombatientes,
a
como miembros
product,
de
in the
un
peace process,
actor
they're a
que
product
antes fue un
of
actor armado
our
y que
troubles,
ahora
and
hizo
they
una
identify
transición
themselves as
hacia,
ex-combatants.
hacia la vida civil.
And they transition
Aunque
into
el
civil
contexto
life, or they
colombiano
have
es
so.
complejo,
So
creo que
our
aquí se podría
context in
acercar
Colombia is quite
un poco al
complex,
contexto
but perhaps it could be
Irlanda del
extrapolated
Norte,
to
que
yours in Northern
menciona
Ireland,
en la medida que
in the way you're
paralelamente
saying,
a
because
el fenómeno de reclutamiento de
we have
niños
the
y niñas
recruitment, or we
que
had the recruitment
participan
happening of
directamente en las
children
hostilidades con
that
actores
participate in
armados, toman
hostilities
parte de
with
frentes a la
armed
confrontación,
groups, and there were
también hay
combatants.
niños y niñas
But
que
then in
participan
parallel, there were children who
digamos, del conflicto de otras maneras, por
were in
unos
the
actores
conflict
que no se
behind the
identifican como parte
lines.
del
They're not
conflicto
actors that
armado, es
see
decir, no
themselves
son
as part of
regidos
the
por el
armed
delito, por
conflict.
el VIH.
They were not, and
¿Cómo
they're not
podría ser, por ejemplo,
governed
la
under
dinámica
matters,
de
or they're not
las
considered to be
grandes
governed
bandas
under matters of
criminales
the
que en
humanitarian
muchos casos
international
tienen
law.
una financiación de narcotráfico?
And we know that some of the
Para esos
organized
niños, y es
criminality
digamos la
groups
discusión
usually have funding
es
from the
absolutamente
big
más
drug
compleja,
gangs.
porque
So
a estos
this
niños y a
complicates
estas niñas
matters.
no se les entiende como víctimas
Those
a modo
children then
necesario,
are not seen as
se les
victims.
entiende como
They are seen
adolescentes
as
responsables, es decir,
teenagers who
ellos
are
se ven únicamente
responsible
por parte del
teenagers,
Estado como
or
personas que
teenagers with
cometieron un crimen.
agency, and the state sees them as
Entonces, a nivel
some
estatal no hay,
as
digamos, una
persons who
promoción de la
actually are
idea
subjects that committed a crime.
de víctimas
Difficult to put them
esos
under
niños
the
y de esos
sphere
niños.
of
Y es,
victimhood.
digamos, una discusión importante
This
que
is
se da
quite a
aquí
relevant
en Colombia
debate,
de
and we do
cuándo
have
esos
it
niños y
in
esas niñas
Colombia.
son
When
víctimas,
those
¿no?
children are
A pesar de
victims,
que ellos y ellas no
when
se
do we
reconozcan como
think of them as
tales, por
victims, even if
ejemplo,
they themselves
para
do not
adelantar
see
los
them,
procesos de
do not
investigación
recognize
penal
themselves as victims,
correspondientes.
so
Ya
that
otra puede ser la discusión en términos de acceder a beneficios
we take into account
administrativos,
how
beneficios de
their place in the
reparación.
criminal justice system. And then a different matter will be the matter of reparation.
Muchas gracias, Juan Manuel. Thank you. I think it was really interesting, both question and answers. I will check if anyone else has another question. I will have a tiny question for both of you if no one else would like to ask something. But I will, especially from your experience of both of you working with communities too, especially communities that are involved in criminal exploitation or forced recruitment of children. So how do you think, or what is the role of the community in the moment of approaching or also redressing or preventing the harms that children that are forcibly recruited for criminal exploitation intentions or for conflict in the case of Colombia? What do you think is the role of the community in preventing and redressing that harm of the children or former children? Would you like to start, Colm, or Juan Manuel, whichever, I don't know which one would like to start. Do you like to go first, Juan Manuel?
Okay. Listo. El
Ready.
rol de la comunidad desde lo que nosotros hemos
The
podido
role
observar
of the
es
community,
fundamental.
from what we have
La
observed,
comunidad
is really, really
debe ser
crucial.
un
The
entorno que
community must
proteja,
be
que
a
facilite las
setting of
condiciones
protection
para
that
que el niño y
actually
la niña se, digamos,
creates the
desarrollen todo
conditions
su
so that
potencialidad de la
children
manera
can
más
fulfill their
adecuada.
potential. You know, it takes a
Entonces, la
village
comunidad
or a town
es
to
un
raise a child. Remember the saying.
potencializador
So they
de las
have
posibilidades
a
de desarrollo integral del niño y de la
potentially
niña. Ahora bien,
benefit that development of children,
en lógica del
the community, I
ejercicio de
mean.
justicia
So
transicional,
when we're
por
talking
ejemplo,
about
en
transitional
Colombia,
justice, at
y
least in the
dado
Colombian
que se
setting,
apela a la idea de
of
la justicia
course,
restaurativa,
we are thinking
la
about
comunidad debe
restorative
tener un lugar
justice. So
central
the
en la implementación de ese
community has
modelo
to
de
be
justicia,
central when we're talking about
porque
this model of
implica un
justice,
diálogo entre
because
el
it
responsable
actually
victimario, la
entails
víctima
a
y la
dialogue
comunidad
between the
con la que
perpetrator, the victim,
coexisten
and the
ambos
community that was
sujetos, ambos
surrounding both
agentes,
subjects,
tanto activo como
perpetrator
pasivo de la
and
conducta criminal.
victim,
Entonces,
whether in an
la
active or a
forma en la
passive
que se
role.
adelanta la reparación, por ejemplo,
So how we
en
move forward with
en
reparation,
un paradigma de justicia restaurativa,
following a
debe
paradigm
incluir a
of
la
this
comunidad.
restorative justice,
Ahora bien,
the community must play a role. Indeed.
particularmente en la JEP, y para el caso del
When we're thinking
reclutamiento,
about the
tal vez no se ha
JEP
avanzado lo
and in
suficiente
terms of recruitment,
en
we are not
que la
as far
comunidad sea
advanced
un
as we
actor
would like to be, so that the community
que,
is an
junto con las víctimas,
party to
desarrolle
the
estas labores
proceedings and can
o
actually
reciba
develop
más bien
this
los
progressive
beneficios de la
role
reparación que
of
deben desarrollar los actores responsables.
benefiting the reparation
Entonces,
process.
es un trabajo que se está construyendo con
So
la
this is something
justicia
that we're thinking
y que
about, that we're
vamos a
trying to
saber
build on,
si
but it's
cumple o
slow
no cumple al
in
final
coming, and we'll
con
see
los
if in the
objetivos que se
end
plantean.
we can that role will be fulfilled.
Yeah, so I totally agree with what was said in terms of the role of the community, and they're central to the research and to understanding the phenomena. They're central to policy responses, and in terms of prevention, the community is critical. However, I think that there's something else. If we understand the mechanisms that are at play with the exploitation of children, part of the approach that that exploitative, largely adults take, is that they create a large mistrust of people from outside the community. That communities become very insular. That the social fabric of children becomes very hyper local. And so, in terms of a response, the community is important, but also breaking barriers down between the community and those outside the community and expanding the periphery of communities. The more that communities mistrust police, mistrust the state, they lack access to effective therapeutic care, the more that they are isolated and excluded from safe places, including schools, education, employment, the more that communities are very insular, and the more opportunities there are to exploit children. So yes, communities are important, but how we see communities and the connection between those communities and those outside needs to be expanded upon, I think.
Yep. Thank you, Colm, and thank you, Juan Manuel. I think that will be the end of the event. It was really, really great for me. Like it was a really good experience of hear you, all of you, of the people who participated in the early panels, and also to you, Juan Manuel and Colm. Like I think it's really insightful and complements a lot like the other experiences of gender-based violence, but like focusing on like the complex experience of children. So thank you again. I don't know what else to say. Muchas gracias a todos los que participaron en el evento. Muchísimas gracias a toda la gente que está en Colombia. Para mí también es muy importante poder tener este espacio bilingüe donde podamos participar y compartir experiencias de ambos países y ambos contextos que son un poco similares, pero al mismo tiempo tienen sus propias características de las que podemos aprender. Entonces, nada más I'm gonna close now like the event, and just if you want to leave the call, that will be perfect. And have a good afternoon in Northern Ireland and UK. Tengan una buena mañana en Colombia. Adiós.